The night Maggie Caldwell pressed her back against the cold cabin wall and listened to Caleb Whitlock's boots drag across the floorboards toward her, she did not scream. She had stopped screaming a long time ago. Nobody came when she screamed. Nobody came when she wept. Nobody came for 3 years. So she stood there in the dark, fists pressed flat against the wood, and she prayed not for rescue, but simply to survive one more night. That was the only thing she still allowed herself to want. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens to Maggie Caldwell is something you will not want to miss. She had a system. It had taken her nearly 3 months to build it, and by now 3 years into her time at the Whitlock Ranch it worked, without her even thinking about it. She knew which floorboards near the kitchen doorway moaned under pressure, and which ones stayed silent if you placed your foot along the left edge. She knew that the third step on the back staircase would announce her presence to anyone sitting in the main room below, and so she always skipped it, swinging her weight to the fourth. She knew that the water pump outside the cabin made a sound like a groan before it gave anything up, and that sound, if she timed it wrong, would draw Caleb Whitlock to the window to watch her. So she pumped in short bursts, quiet, invisible. She had learned to make herself disappear inside her own life. Margaret Caldwell Maggie, to the people who had once known her well, though there were precious few of those left, was 31 years old, and she had the hands of a woman 20 years older. Cracked across the knuckles, rough along the palms. A scar on her right thumb from a knife that had slipped during her second winter on this mountain, when the cold came down so fast and so mean that her fingers had stopped working properly. Nobody had bandaged it for her. She had wrapped it herself with a strip of cloth torn from an old underskirt and kept moving. That was the thing people who had never been truly trapped did not understand. You kept moving, not because you were brave, not because you had hope, but because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant remembering that you had once been a different kind of woman entirely. She had arrived at the Whitlock Ranch in the spring of 1877 with a small leather satchel, her father's old journal tucked inside, and a letter of employment that promised fair wages, reasonable hours, and the kind of honest mountain work she had grown up watching her father do. Her parents were gone by then. The small farm they had worked in eastern Colorado had been lost to death the winter before. Maggie had been left with almost nothing, no family, nearby no land, and enough stubbornness to walk into the hiring office in Glenwood Springs and tell the man behind the counter that she could cook, manage accounts, repair clothing, and work harder than most men half her age. The man had handed her Caleb Whitlock's letter of employment without even looking up. She had been grateful. That was the worst part, looking back. She had been so genuinely, deeply grateful. Caleb Whitlock was 45, wealthy by mountain standards, and owned more land than any man in the Upper Valley. He spoke smoothly and smiled with his whole face, and on that first day he had shown her the cabin room she would sleep in and called it comfortable and told her she would find him a fair employer. She had believed him. Why wouldn't she? The letter was signed. The wage was written. The terms were clear. What the letter did not say, what no letter ever said, was how a man like Caleb Whitlock did business. Within the first month he had begun adding things to her account. A few dollars for the flour she had used in the kitchen. A few more for the lamp oil. The cost of her room, recalculated suddenly as higher than he had first described. Each individual charge seemed small enough that arguing felt unreasonable. But they added up, and every time Maggie sat down to work through the numbers, the total somehow always concluded that she owed him more than she had earned. "You're a smart woman, Miss Caldwell," he told her once, leaning against the kitchen doorframe while she scrubbed the iron pot over the fire. "Smart enough to understand that a place like this costs money to run. You eat here, you sleep here, you owe here." She had looked up at him then. The contract says what I need it to say," he had replied, and his voice had not changed volume or temperature even slightly. That was the thing about Caleb. He did not need to shout. The quiet certainty in his voice was its own kind of violence. You want to take that contract to town and argue it? Fine. I'll tell them you stole from me. I'll tell them every dollar you claim I owe you was already spent on things you took without asking. Who do you think they'll believe, Miss Caldwell? Me or a woman who showed up here with nothing? She had not answered. He had already known she wouldn't. And so the trap closed. Slowly, methodically. The way all the worst traps do so gradually that by the time you understand what has happened to you, the walls are already too high to see over. By her second year, she had stopped talking much to anyone outside the ranch. The few neighboring families who came by for supplies or to discuss cattle prices received the same version of Maggie, quiet, efficient, absent behind the eyes. Caleb had told them she was difficult and prone to exaggeration, and since he was the one who controlled much of the commerce in the Upper Valley, people found it far easier to nod and agree with him than to ask her any uncomfortable questions. She had written one letter to a woman she'd known before, a former neighbor named Ruth, who had moved to Denver and might have had resources Maggie did not. She had written the letter carefully, hidden it inside a flour delivery request, and handed it to the supply man who came twice a month. The supply man worked for Caleb. She never knew whether Ruth received it. By the third year, she had stopped writing. She cooked breakfast before the sun came up. She managed the ranch's account books through the morning because she was by far the most accurate bookkeeper Caleb had ever encountered, and he knew it, even if he would never say so. She mended clothing and saddle leather through the afternoon. She prepared supper and cleaned the kitchen until the fire burned low. Then she climbed the stairs, skipping the third step, and lay down on the narrow cot in her room and stared at the ceiling until her body finally surrendered to exhaustion. And she did it all again the next day. That was the shape of 3 years. The evening that everything began to change was an ordinary one, in the way that catastrophic evenings often are. Caleb had been drinking since mid-afternoon. Maggie had tracked it the way she tracked everything, by sound and weight, and the small tremors in the air around him. The first bottle placed on the table with care, the second placed with less. The third set down hard enough that she heard it from the kitchen and knew without looking what the night would hold. She was moving carefully through the motions of supper preparation when he came in. You wasted the salt pork, he said. She did not turn around. I used the amount the recipe requires. I'm telling you that you wasted it. His voice had that low, deliberate quality she had learned to fear more than shouting. You think I don't notice? You think I don't see every single thing that happens in my own house? I've managed this kitchen for 3 years without complaint from anyone. I'm complaining now. She set the wooden spoon down and turned to face him, because she had learned that turning away could be interpreted as disrespect, and disrespect produced worse outcomes than almost anything. If you feel the portion was excessive, I can adjust tomorrow's menu. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and grabbed her arm, not violently enough to leave a clear mark, but hard enough that she went still immediately, every muscle in her body switching over to the same ancient calculation. Don't escalate, don't react, just survive this moment. You think you're better than this place, he said quietly. You think because you can add numbers and write a clean sentence that you're something special. Let me tell you what you are, Miss Caldwell. You are a woman who owes me. And you will keep owing me until I decide otherwise. She looked at him. She did not speak. He was waiting for her to flinch, to apologize, to fold herself small and say yes and make herself disappear again the way she always did. She could see it in his face, the anticipation of that familiar surrender. And somewhere deep inside her, in the part that still remembered who she had been before all of this, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, quiet hardening. Like the moment just before water freezes. She was still looking at him when the knock came. Not a polite tap, not the measured rap of someone uncertain whether they were welcome. A solid, purposeful strike, the knock of a man who had spent his entire adult life outdoors, where doors were either open or closed and there was no particular patience for ambiguity. Caleb's grip on her arm went loose. He turned toward the sound. The shift in his attention was enough. Maggie stepped back without rushing, putting the kitchen table between herself and where he stood. "Expecting someone?" she asked, her voice absolutely level. "No." The word came out wrong. She filed that away. He straightened his shirt, adjusted his posture into the version of himself he performed for witnesses, and went to the door. The man on the other side was not what Maggie had expected. She had half imagined a traveling merchant, perhaps, or one of the Upper Valley ranchers come to discuss something about cattle. What she saw instead, looking past Caleb's shoulder from across the kitchen, was a man who seemed to have been put together by the mountain itself. Broad across the shoulders, trail-worn in every detail of his clothing. A face that had been in weather for years and had simply absorbed it, lined and calm and entirely without pretense. He held his hat in both hands. That was the first thing that registered. He had taken it off before the door even opened, which meant he had done it in anticipation of encountering people, not as an afterthought. "Evening," the man said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Name's Silas Boone. Trail washed out about 2 miles south. Rockslide took out the lower section of the mountain road about 4 hours ago. I need a place to sleep tonight, and I'll pay fair for the shelter." Caleb looked him over with the particular calculation he applied to everyone he met, measuring what a person was worth and what they could be used for. "You alone?" "Just me and my horse, working man." "I work, yes, sir." Caleb stepped back from the door. "One night. Barn's got a free stall. You can sleep in the loft if the hay's not taken." Silas Boone stepped inside, and that was when his eyes found Maggie across the kitchen. He did not stare. He did not do anything obvious. But she saw the moment of his assessment, quick, thorough, and entirely different from the way Caleb looked at her. Caleb looked at her the way a man looks at a tool he is deciding whether to repair or discard. This man looked at her the way a person looks at another person. "Ma'am," he said with a small nod of his head. It was one word. It should not have done anything to her. She had heard that word 1,000 times in her life. But something about the particular steadiness in the way he said it, not careful, not performed, just natural, made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Mr. Boone," she said. Caleb glanced between them with the sharp attention of a man who noticed everything and decided the meaning of everything according to his own suspicions. "My housekeeper will feed you before you go to the barn," he said, with a specific emphasis on the word housekeeper that was designed to establish a particular order of things. Silas Boone sat down at the table end that Caleb did not indicate, which Maggie noticed was slightly away from Caleb's usual seat, not challenging, simply claiming enough space to be comfortable. He set his hat on the table beside him and looked at it for a moment. "Appreciate the hospitality," he said. Caleb grunted and moved back toward the main room and his bottle. Maggie turned to the stove. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. They were usually not steady after an evening like this one. She set a plate together, what she had, and brought it to the table. Silas looked at it and then up at her, and his expression did not change, but something in his eyes acknowledged what she had not said, that the portions were small because the pantry was poorly stocked. And the pantry was poorly stocked because the man in the next room did not particularly concern himself with the needs of the woman who cooked his meals. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. She started to turn away. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She stopped. In 3 years, not a single person who had come through this ranch had asked her that question. She turned back around slowly and looked at him. He was watching her without performance, no sympathy display, no pitying tilt to the head. Just an honest question from a man who had apparently made a habit of asking honest questions. "I'm fine," she said. He held her eyes for one moment. "All right," he said, and went back to his plate. She stood there for just a breath longer than was necessary. Then she went back to the stove and resumed what she was doing, and the kitchen, except for the fire and the sound of Caleb's bottle being lifted and set down again in the other room. But something had changed, not obviously, not in any way she could have explained clearly if someone had asked her. She had simply been seen, and she had forgotten until that exact moment that being seen was something that had once been ordinary. After Silas finished eating, He thanked her again, picked up his hat, and went to settle himself in the barn. Caleb came back into the kitchen and looked at his plate without touching it, and told Maggie to leave the cleaning until morning because he was tired of the noise. She said yes. She went upstairs. She skipped the third step. She lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. Through the small window above her bed, she could see the top edge of the barn roof against the night sky, and somewhere behind that wood and hay and darkness, a man named Silas Boone was sleeping. A stranger, no reason in the world to think about him. Except that he had asked her if she was all right, and nobody had done that in 3 years, and the question was still sitting somewhere in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending small rings outward in every direction. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, felt her heartbeat. Still there, still hers, she closed her eyes. In the morning she was up before sunrise as always. She dressed in the dark, did not light a lamp until she reached the kitchen, and began the fire in the stove and the first round of breakfast preparations with the automatic precision of someone who had done this exact sequence so many times that her body carried it without instruction from her mind. She did not think about the man in the barn. She was very deliberate about not thinking about the man in the barn. She was in the middle of slicing bread when she heard it. The pump. The water pump that sat 20 feet from the kitchen door, the one Caleb had ignored since the mechanism inside it began grinding wrong sometime in the previous autumn. The one that forced Maggie to walk a quarter-mile down the slope to the spring every morning and carry 2 heavy buckets back up the hill, regardless of whether that pump was making sounds it had not made in 8 months. Working sounds. She set the bread knife down. She went to the kitchen door and opened it. Silas Boone was crouched beside the pump in the gray pre-dawn light, his sleeves pushed up past his elbows despite the cold, working a wrench around the base of the mechanism with the focused patience of a man who understood machinery and had no particular opinion about whether the work was comfortable or not. Tools were laid out beside him on a cloth organized deliberate. He had been at it for a while. She stood in the doorway and watched him without speaking. He didn't look up, but she knew he'd heard her. He had that quality, the awareness of someone trained by years alone in wild country, to know when anything changed in the environment around him. Figured I'd earn my shelter, he said, still focused on the pump mechanism. That pump is broken, she said, has been since fall. Not anymore. He eats a wrench once more, then reached over for a smaller tool and worked it into a different section. Whoever let this go that long should be embarrassed. It's a simple fix, 4 pieces that needed cleaning and 1 that needed replacing. I had the part in my supply pack. She stared at him. You carried replacement pump parts? I carry things that break, he said simply. Because things break. She didn't know what to do with that. The practicality of it was almost stunning, not a grand gesture, not a dramatic offer of help, just a man who had identified a problem and fixed it because it was there to be fixed, and he had the means to do so. Caleb didn't ask you to do that, she said. Silas looked up then. His eyes found hers directly. No, ma'am, he agreed. I'm not fixing his pump. He paused for just a beat. I'm making sure you have water. The silence that followed that sentence was different from other silences. She had lived in silence for 3 years. She knew its varieties the way a woman knows the different sounds of wind, what kind of coming, what it meant, how to prepare for it. But this silence was not threatening or anticipatory or heavy with someone else's displeasure. This silence was simply full. Thank you, she said finally, and her voice came out with a slight roughness she hadn't intended and couldn't entirely explain. He nodded once and went back to the pump. She returned to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a long moment with both hands flat on the wood surface. The bread could wait another minute. She needed a moment to set herself right, because something inconvenient was happening in her chest, and she did not currently have the resources to deal with it, and also make breakfast, and also navigate whatever version of Caleb Whitlock would emerge from upstairs this morning. She breathed, steadied, picked up the knife. When Silas came inside 20 minutes later to wash his hands in the basin near the door, the pump worked perfectly. She had tested it herself, had walked outside and pressed the handle, and heard the water come up without the grinding complaint she had grown accustomed to. and stood there in the cold morning air for a moment, with clean water running over her fingers. Clean water. Right outside the door where it was supposed to be. She told herself it was a practical improvement, nothing more. She told herself it changed nothing about her situation, because it didn't. Caleb's debts were still invented, her wages were still unpaid. The walls of this life were still exactly as high as they had been yesterday. But there was water outside the door, and a man had put it there for her, specifically, without being asked and without expecting anything for it. She set a second cup of coffee at the table near where Silas had sat the night before. When he came inside and saw it, he looked at her. She was already turned back to the stove. "Breakfast'll be ready in 10 minutes, she said. She heard him pull out the chair and sit down, and she heard him say very quietly, "Thank you, Miss Caldwell," and she kept her eyes on the pan and did not say anything else. But she was almost certain that, for the first time in a very long time, the corner of her mouth had moved upward. Just barely. Just enough. Caleb came downstairs at 7:30 with the specific low-grade meanness of a man who had drunk too much the night before and was already looking for somewhere to put it. He saw Silas at the table and stopped on the last stair. "Thought you'd be gone by now," he said. "Trail's still washed out," Silas said, wrapping both hands around the cookie mug with the perfect ease of someone who could not be made uncomfortable by that tone of voice. "Checked this morning. Rockslide took out more than just the road surface. Looks like the embankment below gave way too. Probably need a couple days for it to be passable again." Caleb looked at him, then he looked at Maggie, then back at Silas. "You're saying you need to stay." "I'm saying the mountain needs a couple days," Silas replied pleasantly. "Whether I stay here or sleep outside is your decision to make, Mr. Whitlock. I'll pay for my keep either way." The offer of payment changed the calculation in Caleb's eyes in a way that was almost visible. He stepped down from the stair, moved to his usual seat and looked at Maggie. "Set another plate," she was already doing it. Breakfast was the particular kind of quiet that has too many different things in it to be called peaceful. Caleb ate with the preoccupied focus of a man running numbers in his head, which he often was. Silas ate steadily and without hurry and occasionally glanced around the kitchen with the observational attention Maggie had already noticed in him. She watched him without watching him. He was cataloging, she realized. The same way she always cataloged, gathering information without announcing that he was doing it. He saw the broken hinge on the pantry door. He saw the crack running down the wall behind the stove where the plaster had given way and never been repaired. He saw the mended patches on the kitchen curtains, her work, done carefully but visible to anyone who looked. He saw the account ledger on the corner shelf where she kept it. He saw, she was almost certain, a great deal more than he indicated by any outward expression. After breakfast, Caleb went out to oversee the ranch hands and Maggie began the process of clearing the table. She was reaching for Silas's plate when he picked it up himself and carried it to the washing basin, which no one had ever done in this kitchen. She stared at him. He looked mildly back at her. "Where do you want it?" "In the basin is fine." He set it in. Then he turned and leaned one shoulder against the wall in the posture of a man with nowhere particular to be, which supposed, for today at least, he didn't. "How long you been here?" he asked. 3 years. He nodded, and something in his suspense but deepened slightly, the way a shadow deepens when the light shifts. "Family in the area else?" "No." Another nod. He was not pushing. She had the strong impression that this was not a man who pushed things, that he had learned somewhere in his years outdoors, that most things came to you if you waited with enough patience and stillness. "The ledger on that shelf," he said, not looking at it. "You keep the accounts for this place?" She hesitated. "Yes, you have a head for numbers?" "My father taught me," she said. "He kept books for 3 different landowners in his time. I grew up doing it alongside him." "So you'd know," Silas said, still in that same unhurried register, if the numbers in that ledger were accurate. The kitchen went very still. Maggie set down the cloth she was holding and looked at him directly. He met her eyes without flinching, without triumph, without any of the aggressive probing she might have expected from that question. Just a man who had looked at a situation and said plainly what he saw. "Why would you ask me that?" she said carefully. "Because a woman with your skill and your obvious intelligence has been living on this mountain for 3 years," Silas said. "And she doesn't look like she's living here by choice." The word choice hung in the air between them. Maggie opened her mouth, closed it, looked away toward the window. "It's complicated," she said finally. "It usually is," he agreed. "When it's meant to be." She turned back to look at him. He was still in the same position, same steady eyes, same unhurried patience. Not demanding an explanation, not offering to fix it with some dramatic declaration. Simply aware. "He says I owe him," she said. She had not said it out loud to another person in 3 years. The words felt strange in her mouth, not painful exactly, more like something that had been locked in one position so long that moving it created a kind of ache. "And do you?" Silas asked. "No," she said. It came out flat and certain and without any of the apologetic hedging she might have expected from herself after years of being told the opposite. "No," she said again, because it was true, and she had not been able to say it like that in a very long time. "No, I do not owe him anything. He changed the terms after I arrived. He charges me for things the contract never mentioned. He told people in town that I'm difficult and exaggerate things so that if I ever tried to argue it, they wouldn't believe me. And he keeps the ledger in a way that always shows me owing more than I've earned, no matter how many hours I work." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Does the original contract still exist?" he asked. She blinked. "Ah, yes, I kept a copy. My father always said to keep a copy of everything. It's in my room inside his journal." "Then you have something," Silas said. She stared at him. "It's a piece of paper," she said. "He's a wealthy man with connections to every merchant and official in the Upper Valley. I'm a woman who, according to everyone he's spoken to, has a habit of being dishonest and difficult." "A piece of paper with the original terms and a witness signature," Silas said, "is not nothing." She wanted to believe him. She was surprised to realize how much she wanted to believe him. She had been telling herself for so long that there was no path out of this that she had almost entirely stopped looking for one. And something about the simple certainty in this man's voice, not performative, not dramatic, just factual, made something in her chest clench with an emotion she couldn't immediately identify. Hope, she thought. That's what that is. She had not felt it in a while. It hurt a little, the way a cold limb does when circulation returns to it. From outside, she heard Caleb's voice raised toward one of the ranch hands. Both of them heard it. Silas's expression did not change, but she saw the slight shift in his posture, the particular readiness of someone who had long ago trained himself to identify the emotional charge in a raised voice and calculate its likely direction. "You should start your day," Maggie said quietly. "He'll come back and looking for reasons if he finds you in the kitchen." Silas straightened off the wall. He picked up his hat from the table. He looked at her for one moment longer, then felt entirely neutral. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "for what it's worth, and I understand it may not be worth much, coming from a stranger, I think you've been surviving something that most people would not have lasted through. That's not weakness, that's not being difficult." He paused. "That's just being strong in conditions that weren't made for it." She did not trust her voice immediately. She cleared her throat. "You should go check on your horse," she said. The edge of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more contained than that. He put his hat on. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and walked out the door. Maggie stood in the kitchen alone. She picked up the cloth she had set down. She looked at it. She set it back down. She walked to the corner shelf. She stood in front of the ledger Caleb kept, the official one, the one he showed people, the one that always showed her owing. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went upstairs, skipping the third step out of pure habit, and pulled her father's old journal from the small gap between the wall and the narrow wooden shelf above her cot. She opened it to the back. The contract was still there. Folded small, the paper slightly soft from years against the leather, but intact. The ink was dark and clear and unambiguous. She read it. All of it. Had promised her and what she had agreed to and what the witness, a man named Gerald Foss, notary public from Glenwood Springs, had signed his name to confirm. She sat on the edge of her cot for a long time with the contract in her hands. Her heartbeat was different than usual, steady, not fearful. Something that was not quite anger and not quite courage but lived in the place between them, the place where a person finally becomes more tired of what is happening to them than afraid of what it would take to change it. She folded the contract carefully and placed it inside the pocket of her apron. Downstairs, she could hear Caleb come back inside. Could hear the familiar weight of his boots, the particular cadence of his irritation, already rebuilding itself for a new day. She smoothed the apron pocket with her palm, and she went back downstairs. And she began the next hour of the day. But something was different. She was walking taller without meaning to, not in a way Caleb would necessarily notice, but in a way that she felt down through her spine, out through her shoulders, into the hands that moved through the morning tasks with the same efficiency as always, but without the same bracing against the world that had become so automatic she had stopped recognizing it as fear. The contract was in her pocket. Silas Boone was in the barn. And for the first time in 3 years, Margaret Caldwell was thinking about what came next. The second day began the way all days at the Whitlock Ranch began, with Maggie already awake before the first gray light touched the window. Already moving through the kitchen with the automatic precision of someone whose body had long since stopped needing her mind's permission to work. But the contract was still in her apron pocket. She had moved it there deliberately each morning, from the journal to the pocket, back to the journal at night. She was not certain why she kept doing it. Perhaps because the paper against her hip was a reminder that the thing existed, that it was real, that the terms she remembered were not something she had invented or misunderstood or exaggerated the way Caleb told everyone she did. She was breaking eggs into the iron pan when Silas came through the back door, already dressed, hat in hand, smelling of cold air and hay and the particular cleanness of someone who had been outdoors since before dawn. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's ready," she replied, and pointed with her chin toward the pot on the stove because her hands were occupied. He poured himself a cup without asking where things were, which meant he had already observed the kitchen carefully enough to know. She filed that away. He sat at the same end of the table as the night before. Not Caleb's end, not a challenging position, just enough distance from the center of gravity in the room to make his own quiet claim on it. "Check the trail again this morning," he said. "And South Slope is still moving. There was more shifting overnight, I could hear it from the barn. That road won't be stable for at least another 2 days, maybe 3, he paused. "I don't want to impose on your situation." She looked at him then, quickly, with the sharpness of someone who had learned to hear the underside of everything that was said to her. There was no performance in his expression. He meant it both ways. He didn't want to cause her trouble with Caleb, and he didn't want to pretend the situation was simpler than it was. "You're not imposing," she said. "Your employer doesn't seem thrilled about the arrangement." "My employer is rarely thrilled about any arrangement he didn't personally design." She turned back to the eggs. "He'll accept it as long as you're paying for your keep. After that, it's just weather." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "How long has he been?" He stopped. She waited. "How long has the situation been the way it is?" He finished. She appreciated that he had changed the question. The first version would have required her to define what the situation was, which was a thing she still did not have completely clean language for. The second version she could answer. "Since the 3rd month," she said. "After the first 2, I thought I had simply misjudged the terms and needed to work harder. By the 3rd month, I understood it was never going to balance out." "But you stayed." "I had nowhere to go," she said, and the flatness in her own voice surprised her. "Not self-pity, just fact, no family. Because every wage I earned, he found a reason to apply back to what he claimed I owed. And he had told the town I was." She stopped, pulled a breath. "He had prepared the story before I ever tried to tell mine. That's how it works. You prepare the story about the other person before they can speak, so that when they speak, everyone already has a frame to put it in. She heard the chair shift slightly at the table. A small sound. But she felt it, the quality of his attention change from listening to something more concentrated. "I've seen that before," he said. It was quiet, and she believed him completely. "Most people who end up in these situations have," she said. Caleb's boots hit the floor upstairs. Both of them heard it. The rhythm of the household shifted the way it always did when he was awake, a subtle tightening in the air, the way a room responds to a change in pressure. Maggie moved faster without appearing to. The eggs came off the heat. Bread was already sliced. She had learned to have breakfast at the precise stage of readiness that matched the speed of Caleb's descent. Too early, and things were cold. Too late, and she heard about it. Silas watched her work without comment, but she was aware of him watching. Caleb came into the kitchen with the particular energy of a man who had woken up still carrying the previous day's resentments, like luggage he couldn't set down. He looked at Silas first, then at the table, then at Maggie. "You two having a morning conversation?" he asked. "I came in from the barn," Silas said. Nothing defensive. Nothing that suggested the question deserved more than a factual answer. Caleb sat down. He looked at his coffee cup, then at Maggie, and she poured without being asked, because not waiting to be asked prevented the particular look he gave when he was kept waiting. "One of the cattle in the north pasture is off," Caleb said, apparently to no one in particular but clearly to Silas. "Won't eat. Standing apart from the others. My men are too busy with the fence repair to look at it." "What kind of off?" "Listless. Eyes are strange." "How long?" "2 days, maybe 3. Silas nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup in both hands. "Could be several things. What's the pasture grass situation up there?" Caleb frowned. "What does that have to do with?" "Late spring, if there's been a wet stretch, you sometimes get a bloom of certain plants the cattle pick at when the usual grass thins out. Some of them cause exactly what you're describing, listless, strange eyes off their feed. Not fatal if you catch it early." He paused. "I've seen before." "On my own land." Caleb looked at him with the calculating attention he gave to information that had potential value. "You know cattle." "I know a few things," Silas said. It was not modesty and it was not boasting. It was simply accurate, and the distinction was audible. Caleb ate for a moment. "You want to take a look at it?" "If it would help," Silas said. What happened next was something Maggie would think about many times afterward. Because what Caleb should have done, from the position he occupied and the way he managed every other human interaction in his life, was find a way to use this offer as a transaction, extract the maximum benefit while paying the minimum in return. That was his system. She had watched him apply it to every person who crossed the threshold of this ranch. Instead, something in the offer disarmed him slightly. Because Silas had framed it as help rather than as leverage, and Caleb, who understood leverage with a surgeon's precision, was slightly less fluent in the other thing. "After breakfast," Caleb said. And that was that. Maggie cleared plates and kept her back to the room, and did not let either of them see her face. She was thinking about the cattle, about the fact that Silas had, without appearing to think about it, provided Caleb with a reason to want him to stay that had nothing to do with the washed-out road. He had made himself useful in the specific way that would purchase him more time on the property. Whether he had done that deliberately, she couldn't say. But she had her suspicions. She was washing the pan when he passed behind her to set his cup by the basin, and he said very low and very close, meant only for her, "There's something wrong with more than one of those cattle. I saw them from the barn this morning. You're going to want to hear what I find." She did not turn around. "All right," she said just as quietly. She heard him follow Caleb out. She stood at the basin for a moment with the cloth in her hands and looked at the window above it, at the pale morning light coming through. Then she went back to work. The morning passed in its usual shape. Account books until 10. Mending a torn jacket that belonged to one of the ranch hands until noon. Soup on the stove by 11 so it would be ready by midday. She moved through these tasks with the competence that had become so automatic she could do it all, while thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about Gerald Foss. the notary who had witnessed her contract. She hadn't thought about him specifically. In a long time, he had been a minor figure in the story of her arrival. A small man with precise handwriting who had stamped and signed the document in his office in Glenwood Springs before she climbed into the supply wagon that would take her up the mountain. She hadn't spoken to him since, but his signature was on that paper. And signatures didn't belong only to the past. They were also present tense. They meant that a specific living person had at a specific moment in time confirmed that specific terms existed. She was so deep in this line of thinking that she didn't hear the door open. She heard Caleb's voice before she heard his footsteps. That was wrong. That was backwards from the usual pattern, and she registered it as wrong half a second before she processed what he was saying. "Told you they were worth keeping," he was saying, and his voice had the particular brightness of a man who has been proven right about something, which was one of his most dangerous moods because it made him expansive and unpredictable. Silas came in behind him. He looked at Maggie once, a quick flat look that contained something specific, and then he looked away. "Two of the others are showing early signs," Silas said. "You caught it before it spread through the herd, which is lucky. You need to move the affected animals away from the north pasture today, not tomorrow. Today, and check the grass up there for water hemlock or death camas. Either one can present exactly like this." Caleb was nodding. He had the expression of a man receiving information he intended to own. "My men can handle it this afternoon. They'll need to know what they're looking for," Silas said. "I can show them." "Fine." Caleb moved to the shelf where Maggie kept his personal whiskey, though it was not yet noon. He poured a measure without offering any to Silas, which was intentional. Then he looked at Maggie. "Lunch ready?" 20 minutes, she said. "Make it 15. He took his glass and went toward the main room. The kitchen held the silence that came after him. Silas moved to the basin and washed his hands, working the water pump handle, the same pump he had fixed that morning, with the ease of someone who had repaired things long enough to feel proprietary about them, once they were running right. He dried his hands on the cloth hanging beside the basin, then turned and looked at her directly. "3 of the cattle are sick," he said, "not 2. I told him 2. She went very still. "Why? Because he doesn't manage well when a problem is larger than he expected. He'll freeze up or make a bad decision and then blame someone else for it. If I tell him it's 3, he overreacts and probably makes it 4. He paused. "The 3rd one isn't as far along. We have time. But I needed to be able to stay close to that pasture for the next couple of days, and now I have a reason." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's very calculated," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You're not just a mountain man passing through, are you?" It wasn't a question. He looked at her, and that thing in his expression that was almost but not quite a smile made its appearance again. "I've been a lot of things," he said. "Mountain man is accurate enough." She studied him. "What else, ranch owner?" For a while. He folded the cloth and set it back where he'd found it, exactly where he'd found it, she noticed. "Lost the ranch. Long story. The kind that doesn't improve with the telling." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He lifted one shoulder. "Things end, other things start." He looked at the stove. "That soup's ready to come off the heat." She turned immediately. He was right, the color and the smell were exactly at the edge of perfect. She moved the pot off the heat and stirred it, and behind her she heard him sit back down at the table. "Miss Caldwell," he said. "Maggie," she said without thinking about it. Then, more carefully, "I haven't been called Miss Caldwell by anyone who meant it kindly in a long time. It starts to sound like something else. A beat of quiet." "Maggie," he said. She kept her back to him because her face was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. "The account ledger," he said. "The one on the shelf." "Is that the only copy of the ranch accounts?" She steadied herself. Back to business. This was safer. He keeps a second ledger. In his study, in the locked drawer of the desk. "How different are they?" She turned around now because this required her full attention, and she wanted to see his face when she answered. "The one on the shelf shows me owing him a remaining balance of $112. The one in the locked drawer, she paused. I found it once when he left the drawer open by mistake. The one in the locked drawer shows the actual numbers. Silas looked at her steadily. Which are? I've done the calculation 63 times, she said. Because I wanted to be certain before I trusted my own conclusion. By the actual terms of my original contract, accounting for the correct deductions, he owes me $418 in back wages. The number sat in the air between them. $418. More than most working men in the territory made in a year. Silas did not change expression. You've seen both ledgers. I have a memory for numbers, she said. I saw the second one for 3 minutes. That was enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, Maggie. If someone were to bring what you know to a territorial court, the original contract, the witness signature, the discrepancy between what's on the shelf and what's in the locked drawer, what do you think would happen? I don't know, she said honestly. He has friends in the valley. He has money. And she gestured vaguely at herself, meaning all of it a woman alone, already framed as unreliable. What if you weren't the only one? Silas said. She blinked. What do you mean? I mean that I've been asking around. Quietly. Before I came this way, I stopped in Creed, and before that in a settlement south of here that doesn't have a proper name yet. People know of Caleb Whitlock. He paused. 2 women from this area stopped working for him in the past 5 years. Both of them left without the wages they were owed. Both of them tried separately to argue it, and both of them were told they were exaggerating. He watched her face. Sound familiar? The blood drained from her hands. She sat down. She did not plan to sit down. She simply found herself seated, both palms flat on the table, looking at a fixed point in the middle distance, while her brain reorganized around what she had just heard. She was not the first. She had known it. In the wordless way you know things you don't want to know. But knowing it abstractly and hearing it stated plainly by another person were 2 entirely different things. She was not the first. He had done this for. He had done this before, and she had spent 3 years feeling like the loneliness of it was her specific particular failure, her inability to be persuasive enough, capable enough, connected enough to find a way out. And now this man was sitting at her kitchen table, telling her that it was not a failure at all but a system. A deliberate and practiced system that had been run on other women before her, and would be run on someone else after she was gone if nothing changed. The women, she said. Her voice came out strange. One is in Denver. The other I don't know. He held her eyes. But they exist, and they remember, and they might, if asked the right way by the right person, be willing to speak. She looked at him for a long time. Why are you doing this? She asked. You stopped to sleep in a barn for one night. You fixed a water pump. You didn't have to. None of this is your none of it belongs to you. You could have ridden out at first light on a different road and been 50 miles from here by now, and not known my name. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table. He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. My wife, he said. He said it simply the way he said everything. She was in something like this, he said, before I knew her. Different man, different place, same shape of thing. She got out eventually. It took her a long time. He looked up. I was too late to help her with that part, but I know what it looks like from the outside. And I know that the one thing that makes the difference between a person getting out and a person not getting out is whether somebody outside sees what's happening and decides it's worth stopping for. The kitchen was very quiet. Where is she now? Maggie asked. Gently. Fewer than 2 years ago. Fever. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it so completely that it was almost painful. He nodded once. A small acceptance of something that had stopped being sharp and become a different kind of weight. She was the strongest person I've ever known, he said. Bar none. He looked at Maggie steadily. I'm starting to think she might have competition. Maggie looked away, the window, the light. The ordinary world outside where the cattle grazed and the mountain pressed down on everything with its ancient indifference. She breathed. I don't feel strong, she said. I feel like someone who has been carrying a stone for 3 years and has gotten so used to the weight that she's forgotten what it feels like to walk without it. I know, he said. That's usually how it goes. The stone gets heavy enough, you stop noticing the stone and just notice that walking is hard. He paused. But you still have the contract. She put her hand flat over the apron pocket. Yes, she said. I still have the contract. He stood up. I need to go talk to the hands about the cattle. And then tonight, if you're willing, I'd like you to walk me through the numbers. The real ones, just so I understand the shape of it completely. She looked up at him from where she sat. What are you going to do with the shape of it? Nothing you don't want me to do, he said. Nothing that isn't your decision, start to finish. He picked up his hat. You're the one who knows the numbers. You're the one who has the contract. He seemed to look for the right word and then, finding it, said it plainly, present. He put his hat on and went out the back door. Maggie sat at the kitchen table for a moment longer. The soup was off the heat. The bread was sliced. Everything was where it needed to be. She put her hand on the pocket again, felt the folded paper through the fabric. Then she stood up, straightened her apron, and began ladling soup into bowls with the precise, efficient movements of a woman who had been doing this for 3 years. But something in her posture had changed. Caleb noticed it at lunch. He didn't say anything directly, he never did when he was uncertain what he was observing, but she caught him looking at her twice with that narrowed, calculating attention he deployed when the world wasn't quite conforming to his expectations. She kept her face neutral. She kept her movements exactly as they always were. But inside, beneath the competent surface that 3 years of survival had polished to a perfect finish, something was moving. Slowly, the way ice moves in spring, not dramatically, not loudly. Just the first imperceptible shift of something that has been frozen for a very long time beginning at last to find its way back to water. That afternoon, while Caleb was out with the ranch hands dealing with the cattle situation, Silas came back into the kitchen and sat at the table, and she sat across from him, and she opened the account ledger, the one on the shelf, the visible one, and she talked him through it. She had never talked anyone through it before. There had been no one to tell. She told him everything, every manufactured deduction, every inflated charge. The month Caleb had added a maintenance fee for the cabin room without any prior notice. The quarter when she had worked alongside 2 additional hired men and managed the payroll for all 3 of them, and Caleb had charged her for the privilege of access to the accounts. Silas listened without interrupting. He asked 1 or 2 questions, both of them precise, structural, not skeptical, just clarifying. He was building a mental map of it, she could see that, laying the pieces into order the way someone maps terrain before traveling through it. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. You'd have no difficulty proving this in front of a judge, he said. The discrepancy between the original contract and what's in this ledger is clear enough that a reasonably honest man couldn't argue with it. Reasonably honest, she said. That's doing a lot of work. There's a circuit judge comes through Glenwood Springs every quarter, he said. Next rotation is 8 weeks out. I know because I passed through there last month and saw the notice posted. 8 weeks. She looked at the ledger in front of her. He'll know something is happening, she said. He watches everything. He'll figure it out before then. Maybe, Silas said. Which is why it matters what you do in the next 8 weeks. He paused. And why it matters that you're not alone in it. She looked up. He was watching her with that steady, direct attention that she had decided in the past 2 days was simply how he existed in the world, fully present, fully committed to whatever he was looking at. It was the most unsettling thing about him, because she had forgotten that people could occupy space that way. Without agenda. Without the constant slight lean toward whatever they could extract from the moment. Why are you staying? She asked quietly. The trail is your excuse. But it's not your reason. He was quiet for a moment. Because I stopped, he said, at this door at this moment, and I saw what was happening inside. And I'm not built to see that and keep riding. He looked at her steadily. My wife would have told me to stay, so I'm staying. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back at the ledger and said, "All right. Let me show you the month of April, 1878. That's when it gets really interesting." The edge of his mouth moved. "Show me," he said. She turned the page. And they worked until the light changed, and the sound of Caleb's boots on the porch steps sent them both back to their separate positions her at the stove. Him with his hat and his coffee, like two people who had been doing nothing at all but occupying the same kitchen. But between them, on the table, the account ledger lay open to a page that told a story Caleb Whitlock had been counting on no one ever reading clearly. He had miscalculated, because the woman he had kept quiet for 3 years could read numbers better than anyone in the Upper Valley. And the stranger he had allowed into his barn, because the road washed out, had just become the first person in 3 years to sit beside her while she said so. The ledger sat closed on the shelf the next morning exactly where it always sat, and anyone walking into that kitchen would have seen nothing different about it. Same position, same worn spine, same thin layer of dust along the top edge that Maggie kept meaning to wipe away and kept forgetting because there were always more urgent things demanding her hands. But Maggie knew what was inside it now in a different way than she had before. She had always known the numbers. She had built them herself, line by careful line, watching Caleb's fabrications layer over the truth like sediment over bedrock. But knowing something alone, carrying it in your own chest with no witness and no confirmation, was a particular kind of weight that had a way of making you doubt yourself over time. 3 years of being told she was difficult. 3 years of being told she exaggerated. 3 years of Caleb's patient, quiet certainty pressing against her own memory until she had occasionally, in her lowest moments, wondered if she had simply misread the original terms. She hadn't. Silas had looked at ledger and said plainly, "You'd have no difficulty proving this in front of a judge. Not you might have a case. Not this looks problematic. You'd have no difficulty." The flat certainty of it had done something to her she hadn't expected, not reassurance exactly, but confirmation. The difference between someone telling you the ground is solid and feeling it hold your weight yourself. She was at the stove when Caleb came down that morning, and she heard immediately that something was different in his step. Heavier, more deliberate, the step of a man who had been thinking in the night. He came into the kitchen and stood near the doorway for a moment, looking at her, and she kept her movements exactly as they always were, smooth, efficient, unhurried, because stillness or hesitation would be read and filed away. "Where's Boone?" he said. "I haven't seen him yet this morning," she said. True, she had not. He moved to the table and sat, and she poured his coffee before he could request it. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it. "He know much about fencing?" "The southeast section is down in 2 places." She kept the relief off her face. He wasn't suspicious of Silas. He was calculating use. That was manageable. "I wouldn't know," she said. "You'd have to ask him." "I will." He drank, set the cup down. "He's useful." She turned back to the stove. "I suppose he is." "Doesn't talk too much," Caleb said, which from him was the highest available compliment for another man. She said nothing. "I'm going to ask him to stay on a few extra days," Caleb said. "Past when the trail opens. Pay him for the fence work." The pan in her hand required her complete attention for exactly the next 3 seconds while she processed what that meant. Caleb, who trusted no one and invited no one into his orbit without a clear transactional purpose, was extending an invitation to Silas. Which meant Silas had, in less than 48 hours, positioned himself as valuable in a way that Caleb understood. Which meant they had more time. "That seems practical," she said. Caleb looked at her again with that narrow, assessing look, and then apparently decided her response contained nothing of interest because he looked away. "Make extra at breakfast." "Yes," she said. Silas came in 20 minutes later, hat in hand, and Maggie watched the interaction between the two men with the focus of someone who had spent 3 years reading subtext. Caleb made his offer a few days, fair pay, fence work, plus keeping an eye on the cattle recovery. Silas listened, asked 2 clarifying questions about the fencing material and the property lines, and agreed. Unsentimental. Exactly the right register. When Caleb went out after breakfast to start the morning's work, Silas looked at Maggie across the kitchen. "He asked you about me this morning," he said. "Before you came down," she confirmed. "What did he want to know?" "He called you useful." She paused. "That means he's decided to trust you provisionally." "How long does provisional trust last with him?" "Until you do something that serves your interests more obviously than his," she said. "So be careful." He nodded. "We need to send a letter." "To Gerald Foss," he said. "The notary. He signed your contract. He is a legal witness to those terms. If he's still practicing in Glenwood Springs, his testimony, even a written statement, changes what a judge can dismiss as a he said, she said." She had thought about Foss. She had been thinking about him since yesterday. "If I send a letter through the supply man, Caleb will know about it before it reaches Glenwood Springs," she said. "The supply man reports to him. I learned that the first year." "Not through the supply man," Silas said. "There's a family, the Hendersons. Their farm is about 4 miles east. I passed it on my way up. Independent. Not part of Caleb's supply arrangement." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I talked to their eldest boy yesterday afternoon, when I was checking the south pasture fence line. He's about 16, on horseback for errands twice a week. He goes through Glenwood Springs on Thursdays." Silas looked at her steadily. "That gives us enough time." Maggie sat down. She sat down because her legs had made the decision before her mind caught up. "You've been moving on this since yesterday morning," she said. Not accusing, just understanding. "Since the pump," he said simply. She put both hands flat on the table. She looked at them, rough, cracked, capable hands that had done 3 years of work without a single honest dollar to show for it. She thought about the Henderson boy on horseback, riding through Glenwood Springs on Thursday, carrying a letter she had not yet written to a man whose signature might be the key to a door she had stopped believing existed. "I need paper," she said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet and a pencil stub, and set them on the table in front of her. She looked up at Reddy. "I had it ready," he agreed. She picked up the pencil. "The truth," he said. "Plainly. You don't need to argue your case in the letter. You just need him to know the situation exists and that his signature is material to resolving it. Ask him to provide a written statement confirming the original terms. Ask him to keep the inquiry confidential until contacted again." She wrote. It took her less time than she expected, because 3 years of contained words tend to find their direction quickly once you give them an opening. She wrote 3 paragraphs, clean, precise, the bookkeeper's daughter's handwriting, every letter exact. She read it back, changed 2 words, and folded it. Silas produced an envelope from the same jacket pocket. She gave him a look. "I believe in being prepared," he said. She addressed it, sealed it, set it on the table between them. They both looked at it. "If he receives it," Maggie said carefully, "and if he's willing, we still have to get from a written statement to a hearing. That requires the circuit judge's schedule, a formal complaint, and someone willing to present it." "One thing at a time," Silas said. "The letter is the first thing." She nodded. Then she picked it up and folded it into her apron pocket alongside the contract, and for one moment there were 2 pieces of paper resting against her hip that together weighed nothing and everything. The morning moved forward. It always did. But 2 days later, when the Henderson boy came to the ranch on an errand for his mother and Caleb was occupied in the north pasture with 2 of his hands, Maggie walked to the gate as naturally as if she were checking whether the morning delivery had arrived, and she pressed the letter into the boy's hand with a dollar coin and said, "There's another $1 when you bring me back a reply. You don't mention this to anyone. Do you understand me?" The boy looked at her. He was 16, clear-eyed, and she could tell he understood more about what was happening than he was indicating. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He rode away. She walked back to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter until they stopped. It was done. One piece of it was done. The next several days settled into a rhythm that had its own strange domesticity. Caleb using Silas for the fence work and the cattle management, Silas producing results that kept Caleb's suspicion at bay, Maggie moving through her tasks with the outward sameness of someone who had changed nothing, when in fact she had changed everything she was capable of changing at this exact moment. She and Silas spoke in fragments, necessary words at mealtimes, practical exchanges near the water pump or the kitchen door. They had developed a language of brevity that carried more beneath it than the words themselves, the way people do when they are operating carefully inside a situation that requires them to conceal their actual relationship to each other. Because that was what they had, a relationship. Not the kind that would have been legible to the people around them, not romantic, not transactional, but the particular bond that forms between two people who are, together, quietly dismantling something dangerous. Maggie understood it the morning she woke up and realized she had slept without waking at every sound. She had slept through the night completely, for the first time in she could not remember how long. She lay on the cot in the dark for a moment after she understood this, looking at the ceiling. Feeling the strangeness of it, her body had decided, without consulting her, that she was slightly less alone than she had been. She got up and went downstairs and started the fire. On the fifth day, Caleb's mood shifted. She noticed it before she could have explained why. A slight excess of stillness in him, the kind that preceded a gathering of energy in a particular direction. He came to breakfast and ate without speaking, which was sometimes normal but was today different in texture. He looked at Silas twice with the calculating assessment he usually reserved for people he was trying to categorize. After Silas went out, Caleb stayed at the table. Maggie moved around the kitchen. "You've changed," Caleb said. She stopped, resumed moving. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." His voice was even. "Flat. You're quieter, not your usual quiet, different quiet." "I'm the same as always," she said. "No." He stood up. He moved around the table to the position that meant he was redirecting the conversation into something more physical, not violent, not yet, but present in a way that used space as pressure. "You're thinking about something. I've watched you think about something for a week." She turned to face him because turning away was worse. "I've been thinking about the accounts," she said. "The spring quarter is coming up and the figures need to be reconciled." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that right?" "Yes." "Funny," he said, "because I went to look at the ledger yesterday evening and it wasn't on the shelf." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "I moved it to the table when I was working," she said. Steady voice. "It's back on the shelf." "I put it back before supper." He looked at her for 5 full seconds. She counted them. Then he looked over at the shelf. The ledger was there, exactly where it always was. "Fine," he said, and went out. She waited until his footsteps had crossed the porch and moved toward the barn before she let herself breathe. She pressed one hand against the counter and felt her heart hammering against her palm and made herself stand there through it until it slowed. He was watching more closely now. She had to tell Silas. She found her moment at midday, when Caleb went to speak with one of the ranch hands near the south fence, and Silas came to the water pump for a drink. She was near the kitchen door, and she said it low and fast. He noticed the ledger. "He's watching." Silas went still for a beat. "Does he say anything definitive?" "No, but he knows something has changed. He's not sure what." "How long before he decides to act on suspicion? With Caleb?" She thought about it. "When he's not sure, he probes first, tests. He'll create a situation to see how I respond." She paused. "He's done it before." Silas turned the pump handle, let water run over his wrist, turned it off. He was thinking. She could see it the way his face organized itself around a problem, patient and methodical. "Letter," he said. "How long for a reply?" "The boy said Thursday," she said. "That's 2 days. Then we stay steady for 2 days," he said. "No changes, nothing different. Can you do that?" She almost said yes automatically, because 3 years had trained her to produce whatever answer was required. But she stopped herself and actually considered the question honestly, which felt like a luxury. Yes, she said then, because she had done this for 3 years, kept her face neutral, and her movements even, and her interior life invisible, and 2 more days was nothing against that. Good, he said. He looked at her directly, Maggie. He's going to push before this is over, I know. When he does, and I mean when, not if, don't fold. Whatever he says, whatever he implies he knows, don't fold. Because if he actually had evidence of something, he'd use it immediately. He doesn't probe when he has facts. He probes when he's guessing. She looked at him. You understand how he works very well for a man who's known him less than a week. I've known men like him my whole life, Silas said. Different faces. She nodded. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he confirmed. She went back inside. 2 days was a precise and terrible number of hours when you were counting them. Caleb's probing came the next morning. He waited until Silas was out at the far fence before he came into the kitchen with the particular energy of someone who had spent the night organizing his suspicions into a presentation. I want to talk about your wages, he said, and sat down. Every nerve in Maggie's body went cold and then deliberately calm. She kept moving, kept her back to him for just a moment longer, then turned and sat across from him because sitting was less confrontational than standing, and she needed this conversation to stay at a temperature she could manage. All right, she said. He put his hands on the table. I've been generous with you, he said. You know that. Given your situation when you came here, given the roof and the food and the consistent work, I think I've been more than fair. She said nothing. This was a speech he had given before in various forms, and it required no reply from her because it was not actually addressed to her. It was addressed to the version of her he had spent 3 years constructing, the version that would lower her head and agree. I'm concerned, he continued, that you might be developing certain ideas. About leaving. About your circumstances. His eyes were on her face. That would be a mistake, Maggie. Because if you were to leave before your account is settled, I would be forced to pursue the matter legally. And you know how that would go. She looked at him. She held his gaze with same flat steadiness she had been practicing since the night Silas arrived. I'm not planning to leave, she said. No. He watched her. Then what are you planning? Breakfast, she said. Then the quarterly accounts. Then the jacket for Henderson's order that needs finishing. She listed these things in the same register she would have used to describe the weather. The same things I always plan. Silence, then Caleb leaned back. Good, he said. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstanding between us. After everything I've provided, there's no misunderstanding, she said. He looked at her for one more moment, and she could see him making a decision about what he had observed, deciding whether it confirmed his suspicions or cleared them. She held herself perfectly still inside and let him look, because she had nothing to hide in her face right now, and she knew it. She had done nothing he could identify yet. The letter was gone. The ledger was in its place. The contract was hidden. There was nothing for him to see except a woman sitting at a table, looking at him without flinching. He pushed back his chair. Set breakfast, he said, and went to wash his hands. She turned back to the stove. Her hands moved through the motions exactly as they always did. Inside she was counting. 1 day left. The Thursday reply came not on Thursday but on Wednesday evening, because the Henderson boy had pushed his schedule forward for reasons Maggie would never know and would always silently bless him for. He came to the gate at the back of the property, the one the supply delivery used, away from the main house windows, and pressed a folded envelope into her hand when she came to receive what she had told Caleb was the Henderson family's order for mended clothing. She did not open it then. She carried it inside, set it in the apron pocket with the contract, finished the supper preparation, served the meal, cleared the kitchen, and waited until the house was fully quiet and Caleb's light was out under the door. Then she went upstairs and lit the small lamp and opened the letter. Gerald Foss had received hers. He had written back in a notary's precise, unhurried hand on proper office stationery, the kind of paper that had an official quality to it that no one could mistake for casual correspondence. He remembered her. He remembered the contract. He remembered that Caleb Whitlock had sent a man to his office not 2 months after her arrival, attempting to retrieve the notarized copy and suggesting that the document had contained errors that needed correcting. Gerald Foss had declined to release it. He had declined because in his 20 years of practice, he had never seen an employment contract that needed retroactive correction, and because the man Caleb sent had been unpleasant in a way that made Gerald Foss's instincts sit up very straight. He still had his copy. He had kept it because he had wondered. He would provide a written statement to a territorial court. He would appear in person if required. He would welcome a formal inquiry. At the bottom, in a slightly different ink as though added after the body of the letter was finished, he had written, "I am sorry it has taken this long for someone to ask." Maggie sat on the edge of her cot with the letter in her hands for a long time. "I am sorry it has taken this long for someone to ask." She folded the letter and held it against her sternum for a moment, pressing it there the way you press something you want to keep from floating away. She thought of the letter she had written to Ruth 3 years ago, hidden in the flower delivery request, never knowing if it arrived. The silence that came back where an answer should have been. She had tried. She had tried once, and the way had been closed, and the silence had been so absolute that she had let it become its own kind of certainty. But Gerald Foss had wondered. He had sat in his office in Glenwood Springs with his notarized copy and his professional instincts, and he had wondered all this time. And when she had finally managed to send a letter along a route Caleb didn't own, the answer had come back in less than a week. She had needed someone to show her a different door. That was all. That was the only thing she had needed. She put the letter with the contract inside her father's journal. Then she sat in the dark for a while and let herself feel something she had almost entirely forgotten the texture of. Not hope this time. The morning came hard. Caleb was up earlier than usual, which was rarely a good sign. Maggie heard him moving around downstairs before she had finished dressing, and she came down to find him at the kitchen table already, not waiting for coffee, not reading. Just sitting with both hands flat on the table surface and a look on his face she had seen before and recognized immediately. He had found something, or thought he had. "Sit down," he said. She did not sit. She went to the stove and began the fire, because her hands needed occupation. "I'll sit when the coffee's on," she said, keeping the response in the register of ordinary routine. "That way we're both comfortable." A pause. He didn't push it. She had gambled correctly that the veneer of normality was still more useful to him than rupturing it before he was certain of his ground. The fire caught. She filled the pot and set it on. Then she sat across from him and put her hands in her lap and looked at him with the same open neutrality she had been maintaining for a week. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. She recognized it immediately. It was not her letter to Gerald Foss that had gone and was gone, and he could not have intercepted it. It was not the contract that was in the journal upstairs. It was a different piece of paper entirely. He unfolded it and laid it on the table between them, and it was a letter handwritten brief, not in a hand she recognized. "Found this," he said in Boone's saddlebag. She looked at it without touching it. It was addressed to Silas. The content was brief. She absorbed it in 3 seconds. It was from someone named Thomas Aldrich in Denver. It said the Whitlock account situation may be actionable. Proceed with documentation. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. She looked up at Caleb. His face was controlled, but his eyes were not. And what was in his eyes was not anger exactly, but something colder and more deliberate, the specific expression of a man who has spent years making calculated moves and has just discovered that someone else has been playing the same game. "He came here for a reason," Caleb said. She held his gaze. "The trail washed out," she said. "The trail was convenient," Caleb said. "Who is Thomas Aldrich?" "I don't know," she said, and this was true. She had never heard the name. "He does." Caleb tapped the letter. "He knows someone in Denver who's been looking at my property transactions in this valley." This is not a coincidence, Maggie. Boone did not end up at this ranch because of a rock slide. She looked at the letter again. Proceed with documentation. She had documentation. Gerald Foss's letter. The ledger discrepancies. The months of recorded accounts she had kept in her own memory. Was it possible that Silas had come here already knowing something? That the washed-out road was not why he had stopped, but only the mechanism that made stopping legible? She thought of the way he had assessed the kitchen in his first minute inside it. The questions he had asked. The precision of every move he had made. She thought of him saying, "I've been asking around. Before I came this way." She made a decision in the space of one breath. If Mr. Boone has connections to people who are looking at your business practices, she said, her voice level and clear and entirely without the apologetic softness she had spent 3 years perfecting, then perhaps the question isn't why he stopped here. Perhaps the question is what people in Denver already know about you. Caleb went very still. She held his eyes and did not look away. Something had changed in the kitchen. She could feel it not just in him, but in herself. Because that was the first time in 3 years that she had looked at Caleb Whitlock directly and said something that put the pressure back on him, instead of absorbing it herself. He picked up the letter slowly, folded it, put it back in his jacket. "Where is Boone right now?" he said. "In the barn, I'd assume," she said. He stood up. She stood up too. "I'll let him know you'd like to speak with him," she said, because framing it that way gave it a different shape than being sent to fetch someone, and the difference mattered, and Caleb was too preoccupied to catch it. She went to the back door. She opened it. She stepped out into the morning air. And what she felt walking across the yard toward the barn was not fear. It was the opposite of fear. It was the feeling of someone who has been running in the wrong direction for a very long time, and has finally turned to face what's behind them, not because the thing behind them is safe, but because running was never going to save them, and they have finally understood that. She pulled open the barn door. Silas looked up from where he was saddling his horse. He took one look at her face and set down the strap he was holding. "What happened?" he said. "He found a letter in your saddlebag," she said. "From someone named Thomas Aldrich in Denver. About Whitlock." "About documentation." Silas was still for exactly 1 second. Then he said calmly, as though he had considered this possibility and was not surprised by its arrival, "All right. He knows you didn't come here by accident," she said. "No," Silas said. "He thinks he knows that. There's a difference." He moved toward her. "Are you all right?" She looked at him. "Who is Thomas Aldrich?" He held her gaze. "A lawyer. In Denver. Who has been tracking certain land and labor practices in this valley for the past 18 months as part of a broader inquiry into property fraud." He paused. "I've been corresponding with him. I came through this area specifically because his documentation pointed here." She absorbed this, every piece of it. "You came for Caleb," she said. "Not for a washed-out road. The road was genuinely washed out," he said. "I came through this area because of the inquiry. Stopping at this ranch because the road was out, that was real. But I would have found my way here eventually, because of Thomas Aldrich's inquiry." "Yes, and because of me?" She needed to know this. She needed the shape of it, to be honest. He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't know your name before I knocked on that door," he said. "But by the time I left that kitchen the first morning, the answer to your question is yes." He said it plainly. Not performing it. Just saying it the way he said everything that was true. She nodded once. She felt something settle inside her, not because the answer was simple, but because it was honest, and honesty was its own kind of solid ground. "He's waiting for you," she said. "He's going to try to threaten you with the letter. Try to make you feel caught." "I know," Silas said. "Don't let him," she said fiercely. Something moved across his face that she hadn't seen there before. "No, ma'am," he said. "I won't." She looked at him for one more second. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, and her stride was different than it had been when she walked out, longer, more direct. With the particular quality of someone who has stopped negotiating with the ground beneath her feet and has decided simply to cross it. Caleb was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her come. She walked straight toward him. She did not slow down. She did not lower her eyes. and he stepped aside to let her through, and she was fairly certain that in 3 years of living in this house, that had never happened before. Not once. She went to the stove and poured the coffee that had been ready for 5 minutes, and her hands were perfectly steady, and she did not say a single word, and she did not need to. Because something had already been said in the way she had walked back across that yard, in the way she had not looked down, in the way her footsteps on his porch had sounded like someone who had remembered, finally and completely, that the ground belonged to anyone who was willing to stand on it. Caleb Whitlock did not raise his voice when Silas walked back into that kitchen. That was the thing about him, the thing Maggie had tried to explain to herself for 3 years without finding language adequate to it. Another man might have shouted. Another man might have made threats loud enough to bring the ranch hands running. But Caleb's particular brand of menace had always lived in the quiet, in the deliberate lowering of his voice, a register that forced everyone around him to lean slightly forward to catch what he was saying, which put them, almost imperceptibly, in a position of supplication. He sat at the table. He had poured himself coffee. He had the letter on the table in front of him, folded, one hand resting flat on top of it. Silas came in and stood near the doorway and looked at him without performance. Maggie stayed at the stove. She was not invisible, she had stopped trying to be invisible, but she was occupied, which gave her a reason to remain in the room that Caleb couldn't easily challenge without revealing that her presence bothered him. "Sit down, Boone," Caleb said. "I'm all right standing," Silas said pleasantly. A pause. The small refusal registered in Caleb's eyes. He looked at the letter. "Thomas Aldrich," he said. "You know him well?" "Well enough," Silas said. "He's been asking questions about property arrangements in this valley." Caleb's voice was even. "Informational. My name has apparently come up in those conversations." "Has it?" Silas said. "You know it has. That's why you're here." Silas was quiet for a moment. "The road was washed out," he said. "That part is true. But you were in the area for a reason." "I'm often in areas for reasons," Silas said. "Men who travel tend to have them." Caleb looked at him steadily. He was making a calculation, Maggie could see it. The slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was sorting through what he knew versus what he suspected versus what he could afford to say out loud without overcommitting. He was a man who never spent more than he had to. That applied to words as much as money. "You've been talking to her," Caleb said, and his eyes moved to Maggie without warning. She felt the shift in the room. She kept her hands moving. "I've been talking to everyone who comes through this kitchen," she said. "That's what cooking for people involves." "Don't be clever," Caleb said, and for the first time something sharp entered his voice. "Just a thread of it. Just enough to show her it was there." "She's been doing her job," Silas said, and there was something different in his voice now too. Not sharp, not loud. Just a particular solidity that had the quality of a door being placed in a frame. Final, without negotiation. The same just been doing for 3 years, without the wages she was promised. The kitchen went very still. Caleb set his coffee cup down. "Careful," he said. "I'm always careful," Silas said. "That's how I've been having this conversation for a week, without you realizing what was in it." Maggie's breath caught. It was the most direct thing Silas had said in Caleb's presence since he arrived, and she watched Caleb absorb it, watched the particular reorganization that happened in his face when a situation stopped conforming to his understanding of it. "You need to leave my property," Caleb said. "Today." "Trail's still not fully passable," Silas said. "I'll have 2 of my men ride with you to make sure you get through." He stood up. "And when you get to Glenwood Springs, you can tell Thomas Aldrich that I have every document pertaining to every labor and property arrangement I've ever entered into, and that anyone who wants to make claims against me is welcome to try." "That's good to hear," Silas said, "because that's exactly what someone is going to do." Caleb looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at Maggie. She looked back at him. 3 years of looking away. 3 years of finding something neutral to focus on: the floor, the stove, the window, anything that was not his face, because meeting his eyes directly had always felt like a provocation she couldn't afford. She looked at him now, directly, without apology, without the slight lowering of her chin that she had developed as automatically as breathing. Something crossed his face that she had never seen there before. It took her a moment to identify it, because she had stopped expecting to see it. He was uncertain. "Get out," he said to Silas. "Maggie," Silas said, without moving, without looking away from Caleb. "Do you want to leave?" It was such a simple question. 3 words. The kind of question a person asks another person when they are treating them as a person. Not as a problem to be managed, not as a variable in someone else's calculation. "A person, yes," she said. She said it clearly. She said it in the same voice she had used to recite accounts and manage ledgers, and answer every question Caleb had ever directed at her own voice, the one she had been born with. The one her father had heard when she read numbers back to him across the kitchen table of a different life. "Then go pack your things," Silas said, still looking at Caleb. "Take what belongs to you." Caleb moved toward Silas. Not violently, he was too controlled for that, and there was something in Silas's stillness that any man with functional instincts would have recognized as a significant obstacle. But he moved into the space between Silas and the staircase with the deliberate placement of someone who was accustomed to using his body as architecture. Blocking, containing. "She owes me money," he said quietly. "No," Maggie said. She said it from across the kitchen, and she said it the same way she had said it to Silas that first morning, flat certain, without any of the hedging she had spent 3 years layering over everything she said. "No, Caleb, I don't. The accounts, I know every number in those accounts," she said, and she was walking toward the stairs now, not around him but toward him, because she was done routing herself around this man. "I have known them longer and more accurately than you have. I know the number in the ledger on that shelf, and I know the number in the ledger in your locked desk drawer, and I know the number in the original contract that Gerald Foss witnessed and still has a copy of in his office." In Glenwood Springs. She stopped 2 feet from him. She looked up at him. "So when I tell you I don't owe you anything, Caleb, I am not guessing. I am not exaggerating. I am not being difficult. I am telling you the precise mathematical truth. And in 8 weeks, when the circuit judge comes through, I am going to tell him the same thing with documentation." The silence that followed was the most complete she had ever experienced in that house. Caleb stared at her. She watched him do the calculation rapid, thorough, the way he always calculated. He was measuring what she knew against what he could still contain. He was measuring Gerald Foss's continued existence as a notary with an intact copy. He was measuring Thomas Aldrich in Denver and whatever Aldrich had been building for 18 months. He was measuring Silas standing in the kitchen doorway like something the mountain had put there specifically to be unmovable. And then, for the first time in 3 years, Maggie watched Caleb Whitlock's calculation come up short. "You're making a serious mistake," he said. "I made a serious mistake when I trusted your employment letter," she said. "I'm correcting it now." She looked at him for one more beat. "Excuse me." She went around him. She went up the stairs. She did not skip the 3rd step. Her room was small and she had very little. 3 years of wage theft had made certain of that. She took her father's journal with the contract and Foss's letter tucked inside. She took her spare dress and the wool coat she had mended twice. She took the small account notebook she had kept privately, where she had recorded the real numbers in a shorthand only she could read. 63 calculations, all arriving at the same conclusion. She took the photograph of her parents from the shelf above the cot. She stood in the room for one moment and looked at the narrow cot, the low ceiling, the window that showed the mountain pressing down on everything with its ancient indifference. She had survived in this room. She was leaving it. She went back downstairs. Caleb was not in the kitchen. She could hear his voice outside, raised slightly, directed toward someone, probably one of the ranch hands. Silas was standing at the kitchen table with her satchel open, placing her spare bread and cheese into it without being asked, because he had apparently decided that whatever she was bringing with her should not include hunger. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up, looked at the small bundle in her arms. Looked at her face. "Yes," she said. He closed the satchel and held it out to her. She took it. She put the journal and the coat and the notebook inside. She buckled it closed. She looked around the kitchen, the stove she had lit every morning for 3 years, the pump outside the door that now worked, the ledger on the shelf, the flour she had measured by feel in the dark. She turned away from it. They walked out together. Caleb was near the barn with two of his hands, gesturing at the south fence with the controlled anger of someone who has redirected fury into logistics. He saw them come out. He watched them. He did not move toward them, and Maggie understood why he was calculating still, even now, whether any physical action would improve or worsen his position. He was the kind of man who never spent anything without expecting a return. For once she left him to his accounting. Silas saddled his horse. He helped her up onto a second horse, a chestnut mare, from the barn that he had apparently also arranged for, which she chose not to examine too closely, and they rode out of the Whitlock property at a pace that was neither fleeing nor leisurely, simply purposeful. She did not look back. They rode in silence for a while, the mountain road opening out ahead of them, the morning air sharp and clean in a way she had stopped noticing until just now, when she was moving through it toward something, instead of through it in a circle. "Where are we going?" she said. "Glenwood Springs," he said. 4 hours. "We'll be there before dark, Gerald Foss," she said. "First stop," he confirmed. "Then Thomas Aldrich's associate in town, a man named Cooper, who handles the local documentation for the inquiry. He's been expecting something from this direction for 3 weeks." She looked at him. "You really did plan this?" "I planned for possibilities," he said. "You're the one who decided to use them." She looked ahead at the road. "The mountain. The sky. He'll tell people I stole from him," she said. "Before we get to town. He'll send word ahead, probably. Cooper and Foss will hear a story about me before we arrive." "They've been hearing a story about you for 18 months, Silas said. "Aldrich's inquiry includes the accounts of 2 other former workers. Both women. Both told the same story you were told, that they were difficult, that they exaggerated, that they owed him money." He paused. "One of them is in Denver right now, and she has agreed to provide testimony." Maggie absorbed this in stages, the way you absorb cold water, first the shock of the temperature, then the particulars of it. "You've been building this case for a year and a half," she said. "Aldrich came in later." He glanced at her. "He found the pattern in the property records. Whitlock has used the same labor arrangement method on at least 4 separate people across 7 years. The 2 women. A young man who worked the cattle for 2 seasons and left with nothing. And one family, a husband and wife, who worked a neighboring plot that Caleb eventually absorbed into his own holdings through what amounts to manufactured debt." She was quiet for a long time. 4 people, she said. "That we've documented. There may be more." She thought about the 3 years she had spent believing herself specifically isolated. Specifically failed. The particular shame of a trap is that it is always designed to feel like your own inadequacy. You don't escape because you are not clever enough, not brave enough, not connected enough. The trap never announces itself as a system. It always presents itself as your personal shortcoming. "He's done this for 7 years, she said. "At least." And nobody stopped him. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Nobody had everything in the same place at the same time," he said carefully. The women's accounts were separate. The property records were in different offices. The labor arrangements were legal enough on the surface that without the original contract terms and a witness who remembered them, the discrepancy was hard to prove. He paused. "You have the contract, you have Foss. You have the account records in your own memory. That's everything in one place." She understood what he was saying. She was not one piece of the case. She was the piece that made the case. She straightened in the saddle. They rode on. Gerald Foss was a small man with extremely precise handwriting and the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades being the least dramatic person in every room, which he had learned to appreciate as a professional asset. He received them in his office in the late afternoon, a narrow room above the hardware merchant, lined with files in a system so organized it seemed to generate its own kind of calm. He stood when Maggie came in and he said, "Miss Caldwell, and the way he said it with recognition, with something apologetic around the edges, made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Mr. Foss," she said. "I should have found a way to reach you sooner," he said. "When that man came for the contract, Whitlock's man, I knew something was wrong. I've regretted not pursuing it ever since." "You kept the copy," she said. "Yes." "Then you did what mattered," she said, and meant it. He had the document already out, his copy, pristine, the ink as dark as the day he had stamped it. He laid it beside her copy on the desk, and they compared them, line by line, and they were identical in every particular. Same term, same date, same witness stamp. Thomas Aldrich's associate, a compact, efficient man named Franklin Cooper, arrived 20 minutes later and sat across the desk from Maggie and asked her questions for 2 hours. She answered all of them. She answered them in the same voice she had used in her kitchen, precise and clear, and she pulled the notebook from her satchel and walked Cooper through 63 calculations and the methodology behind each one. And she described the locked desk drawer and the second ledger, and the specific morning she had seen it when the drawer was left open, and she described the month-by-month erosion of her wages through manufactured charges. And she described the letter to Ruth that never arrived, and the supply man who reported to Caleb, and the way that had been prepared to distrust her before she had ever opened her mouth to speak. Cooper wrote for the entire 2 hours and asked good questions and did not once suggest that she was exaggerating. When it was over, he set his pen down and looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. "What you've brought today, the original contract, Foss's copy, your account records, your testimony about the second ledger, this is enough. This is more than enough. The circuit judge's next sitting in this district is in 6 weeks. 8 weeks, she said. Mr. Boone said 8. Schedule moved forward, Cooper said. Judge Hartley is coming through 3 weeks early because of a land fraud matter in the next county that's been consolidated into this circuit. He paused. Which is relevant. She looked at him. Why? Cooper looked at Silas briefly, then back at her. The land fraud matter in the next county involves property acquired through manufactured debt arrangements. The property records show a pattern consistent with what you've described. He set his pen down. Caleb Whitlock's name appears in those records as well. The room was very quiet. She had walked in here today, carrying what she knew, which had felt, for 3 years, like almost nothing. And what she was finding was that it was not almost nothing. It was one clear piece of a much larger picture that multiple people had been separately trying to assemble, and her piece, her contract, her memory, her 63 calculations, was the piece that made the rest of it readable. 6 weeks, Cooper confirmed. She looked at Silas. He was watching her with that expression she had come to recognize, the one that contained more than it showed, the one that was present without pushing. He had known about the land fraud connection. She was almost certain he had known, and had not told her, because he had understood correctly that she needed to walk into this room carrying her own story, without the weight of everything else attached to it. She would decide later whether that had been the right call. Right now she was too full of the present moment to assess the past. What do I need to do between now and 6 weeks from now? She asked Cooper. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had spent a year and a half chasing something that had just walked through his door under its own power. Exactly what you're already doing, he said. Stay safe. Stay accessible. And be ready to speak. She nodded. I can do that, she said. They found a boarding house that evening. Cooper arranged it. A woman named Mrs. Alcott, who took in respectable travelers and asked no unnecessary questions. Silas paid for 2 rooms without discussion, and Maggie accepted this as she had been accepting his practical assistance all week, as a fact of the situation rather than an obligation to be repaid. Because that was how he offered things, and she had decided to receive them in the spirit they were given. She sat in the room that evening with her father's journal in her lap and the photograph of her parents on the windowsill and the mountain outside going purple with the last light of the day. She was no longer on the Whitlock ranch. She was in a town, in a room she did not have to earn by suffering, and in 6 weeks a judge was going to sit in a courthouse and hear what she had to say. She was not naive about the difficulty ahead. Caleb had money and connections and 3 years of prepared narratives. He had lawyers who knew this valley and a reputation built on strategic generosity toward the people whose opinions mattered most. She had a contract, a notary, and a woman in Denver whose name she didn't yet know but whose experience had rhymed with hers so precisely that the similarity was itself a kind of testimony. It was not going to be simple, but it was going to happen. She was going to speak. The next morning, she went to the telegraph office and sent a message to Thomas Aldrich in Denver. Cooper had given her the address, saying only, "Miss Caldwell is here." Contract confirmed, ready to proceed. The reply came back in 2 hours. "We are ready. The Denver witness has been notified. Her name is Clara Voss. She remembers everything." Maggie folded the telegram and put it in the journal with everything else. Clara Voss. A name. A woman who had stood in the same trap and found her way to the other side of it and remembered everything. She thought about what that meant, not abstractly but viscerally. Clara Voss existed. Clara Voss was in Denver right now, having been asked to step back into the worst period of her life and describe it to strangers in a formal proceeding, and she had said yes. Because being asked mattered. Because not being asked, for all those years, had been its own kind of wound, and being asked now, by people who were finally listening, was a chance to close it. Maggie understood that, completely. The days that followed had a different texture from anything she had experienced in a long time. She was not idle. She helped Mrs. Alcott with the boarding house accounts, in exchange for reduced room cost, which the older woman accepted with the practical appreciation of someone who recognized competence when she encountered it. She wrote out her full testimony in longhand, 3 times, until the language was clean and precise and organized in the order that made the facts most legible. She met twice more with Franklin Cooper, and once with a territorial solicitor he brought in from the neighboring county, a woman which Maggie had not expected, and which made her want to weep with a relief she could not entirely explain. The solicitor's name was Helen Park. She was 40, sharp-faced, and had the particular efficiency of a person who has spent years in rooms that were designed to be comfortable for everyone but her. "You understand the defense will argue that you accepted the conditions," Helen said at their first meeting. "I understand," Maggie said. "They'll say the charges were disclosed and that you agreed to remain despite them." "The contract shows what was disclosed," Maggie said. "Everything added after my arrival contradicts those terms. I have the dates and the amounts." Helen looked at her notebook, then looked at Maggie. "You have a very organized memory." "My father taught me that numbers are honest," Maggie said. "They don't adjust themselves to be more comfortable for anyone. They just are what they are." "Then let's make sure the judge hears what they are," Helen said. Silas stayed in Glenwood Springs. He found work quickly. There was always work for a man who could handle cattle, fix equipment, and read a pasture's problems from the way the animals moved through it. He did not stay because Maggie needed him to. She had made clear in the course of several conversations over coffee in Mrs. Alcott's small sitting room that she was capable of proceeding without assistance, that she had Cooper and Helen and Gerald Foss and her own account records and 63 calculations, and that she did not require a guardian. He had agreed. He said he understood. He said it plainly, which was the only way he said things. And then he had stayed, because staying was its own kind of choice, and he was making it. And because the distinctions between staying because someone needed you and staying because you wanted to be near them was a distinction that Maggie was only now slowly beginning to have the interior resources to examine. She examined it in small increments. The way he looked at her across the table when she said something precise and accurate, not surprised by the precision, just attentive to it, the way you're attentive to something you find valuable. The way he always asked before he helped with anything. Not assuming, not taking over, just offering and then waiting. The way he talked about his wife, not with performance or for sympathy. Just with the direct simplicity of a man who had loved someone and lost them, and was carrying that honestly, without making it into something for other people to manage. She thought about what it meant that he had come to the Whitlock Ranch, already knowing something was wrong there. She had thought about it a great deal, actually, and had arrived at an understanding that was more complex than either betrayal or perfect innocence. He had come to the area because of the inquiry. He had stopped because the road was washed out. He had stayed because he had seen what was happening inside that house, and because he was, as he had told her, not built to see that and keep riding. Both things were true at once, the inquiry and the choice. The information and the response to her specifically. She understood that this was how complicated things worked. Not clean, not simple. True in multiple directions simultaneously. She was getting better at holding complicated truths without needing to flatten them into something more manageable. 3 weeks before the hearing, a development arrived that none of them had anticipated. Cooper came to Mrs. Alcott's with his hat in his hands and a particular expression on his face that she had learned to read over the past weeks as meaning the situation has changed and I'm working out how to tell you. What happened, she said immediately. Whitlock has retained Marcus Webb, Cooper said. She didn't know the name. She looked at Silas, who was sitting across the room. His expression told her enough. Webb is the best defense lawyer between Denver and the Utah Territory, Silas said. He's won cases that should not have been winnable. How, she asked. He's very good at making the other side's witnesses seem unreliable, Cooper said carefully. He specializes in finding inconsistencies, things people remember differently than the record shows. Things that seem small but that he can use to suggest a pattern of misrepresentation. She looked at him steadily. He's going to come after my account records. Probably. And my testimony. Yes. He'll suggest that a woman who spent 3 years keeping the accounts under duress might have arranged the numbers to support her own claims, she said. She was not asking. She was mapping the attack. That's my assessment, Cooper said. She set her coffee down. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to the first page of calculations and set it on the table in front of Cooper. My father was a bookkeeper, she said. He kept accounts for 3 landowners over 30 years and never had a single figure disputed. He taught me his system. Every number I recorded in this notebook has a date, a source, and a corresponding entry that can be cross-referenced against the public record of Whitlock's supply purchases and cattle sales. Because those are matters of public commerce and anyone can access them. She looked at Cooper. Webb can suggest my numbers are invented, but the supply merchant's records are not mine. The cattle auction records are not mine, and they will match my figures exactly, because I recorded what was real. Cooper looked at the notebook, then at her. Then he picked it up and began reading. Silas was watching her from across the room. She did not look at him. She was focused on Cooper, on the problem, on the 6 weeks of work she had already done, and the 3 weeks of work still ahead. But she heard him, very quiet, say, "She's going to be all right." He wasn't talking to anyone in particular, just saying it. The way you say something true when you've been waiting a while to be certain of it. Cooper lowered the notebook. I need to get these figures to Helen tonight, he said. I'll make a complete copy, Maggie said. Tonight. You'll have it in the morning. He stood. He looked at her with the expression she had seen several times now, the particular look of started, the process thinking they were helping, and has realized somewhere along the way that the help is flowing in the other direction. Miss Caldwell, he said, for what it's worth in 15 years of this work, I have rarely seen anyone come into this process as prepared as you are. She looked at him evenly. I've had 3 years to do the preparation, she said. Even if I didn't know I was preparing, he left. She opened the notebook again and began the copy. Silas got up and moved to the other end of the table, where he sat across from her with his coffee and did not speak. He simply occupied the room the way he always did, fully present, not requiring anything from her attention, just there. She wrote. The mountain outside the window went dark. The lamp between them burned steady. And Maggie Caldwell, who had spent 3 years making herself disappear, sat in clear light at a table with another person and wrote the truth down in her precise, honest hand, every number exactly what it was, every date exactly when it happened. Every figure a piece of an accounting that was finally going to be heard. 2 weeks before the hearing, Clara Voss arrived from Denver. She was younger than Maggie had imagined, late 20s, dark hair, with the particular stillness of someone who has decided that the world's opinion of her emotional state is no longer something she is going to perform for. She came into Cooper's office with a leather case of her own documents, shook Maggie's hand, and said, "He told you you owed him money, didn't he?" "Yes," Maggie said. "He told me the same thing," Clara said. "Right down to the phrasing." They looked at each other for a moment, two women in a small office in a mountain town, who had never met, who had been kept from meeting deliberately by the design of a system that depended on each of them believing she was alone. "He charged you for the room," Maggie said. "And the food," Clara said. "And the lamp oil." "The lamp oil," Maggie said, and heard the slight fracture in her own voice and held it together by main force. "Every single month," Clara said, "a few cents. Never enough to argue." Until it was. Helen Park came in and spread documents across the table, and they all got to work. That evening, Silas found Maggie sitting on the front step of the boarding house in the dark, not distressed. Just present with the night and the mountain, and the particular weight of having spent 4 hours in a room with Clara Voss being a witness to her own history reflected back at her in someone else's face. He sat down beside her, not too close, not performing distance either. Just near enough to be company. They sat without talking for a while, which was something she had discovered she could do with him, occupy silence together, without it being the kind of silence that required management. "She's going to testify," Maggie said finally. "I know. She flew out here from Denver. She has a life there now." "She didn't have to come." "No," he said, "she didn't. She came because she was asked." Maggie looked at the sky. "That's all it took. She was asked and she came." A pause. "I think about the letter I sent to Ruth 3 years ago. Through the supply man. If it had gotten through, if Ruth had known." "You might have gotten out sooner," Silas said. "Or not at all," she said. "Because I wasn't ready yet. I didn't have the contract fixed in my mind the same way I did after you asked me about it. Sometimes the asking matters as much as the timing." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a general philosophy or a specific one?" She looked at him sideways. "Both," she said. The edge of his mouth moved. "Fair enough." They sat a while longer. "Silas," she said. "After this is..." She stopped. Started again. "After the hearing. Whatever comes of it. What are you going to do?" He considered this with the same patience he brought to everything. "Depends partly on what comes of it," he said. "If Aldrich's broader case holds, there'll be property matters to sort through in the valley. That could take time. And I've got land north of here. My own. Needs work." "I didn't know you still had land," she said. "It's not the ranch I lost," he said. "Different parcel. I've been adding to it slowly. It has potential." He said it, the way he said things that mattered to him, understated, careful, like he was offering something he wasn't certain would be received well. "What kind of potential?" she said. "Cattle, eventually. But first it needs better infrastructure."
"Accounts managed properly."
He paused. "Someone who knows what they're doing with numbers." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountain. "That sounds like a job description," she said. "It does, doesn't it?" he said. She turned back to the mountain, too. "We should go in," she said after a moment. "I have to finish the testimony outline before tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and stood, and offered his hand to help her up. She took it. His hand was warm and rough and real, and she held it for exactly the length of time to stand, and then she let go and they went inside. But she was almost certain, walking up the stairs to her room to finish the outline that was going to help take down a man who had stolen 3 years of her life, that she was smiling. Not because anything was settled yet, not because the hard part was over, but because she had something she hadn't had in a very long time. Something to look forward to. And that after 3 years of only looking ahead far enough to survive the next hour felt like the most radical thing that had happened to her yet. The night before the hearing, Maggie did not sleep. She did not pace, she did not cry, she simply lay on the narrow cot in Mrs. Alcott's boarding house and looked at the ceiling and let her mind do what it needed to do, run every number one final time, check every date. Hold every piece of testimony in its proper order, the way you hold a deck of cards you've shuffled so many times that your hands know the sequence before your eyes confirm it. She had the contract. She had Foss's copy. She had 63 calculations that matched the public supply records and the cattle auction records to the penny. She'd Franklin Cooper and Helen Park and Clara Voss, who was sleeping 2 doors down the hall in her own room paid for by Thomas Aldrich Inquiry Fund, having come all the way from Denver for tomorrow. She had everything. That was not what was keeping her awake. What was keeping her awake was simpler and older than strategy. It was the particular fear that lives not in your mind, but somewhere below the sternum, the fear of being disbelieved. Of standing in a room full of people, saying true things and watching their faces remain unconvinced. She had lived under the architecture of Caleb Whitlock's prepared story for 3 years. He had built it carefully. He had maintained it. He had friends in this valley whose loyalty had been purchased long before Maggie ever arrived, and Marcus Webb was one of the finest defense lawyers between Denver and Utah. And tomorrow morning she was going to walk into a courthouse and say out loud everything she had spent 3 years being told was a lie. She put her hand over her sternum, felt her heartbeat. Still there. Still hers. She thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table with the account ledger between them, running his finger down a column of numbers and saying, "A figure doesn't care who's uncomfortable with it, Maggie. It is what it is. Your job is just to read it honestly." She breathed. She was at the window when she heard the quiet knock at her door. One knock, unhurried. She knew the cadence. She opened the door. Silas was standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands, not in the doorway but a respectful step back from it, which was such a specifically him thing to do that she felt something ease in her chest just from seeing it. "Saw the light under your door," he said. "I'm not sleeping," she said. "I know, me either. There's coffee downstairs. Mrs. Alcott left a pot on the stove. I can leave you be. Whatever you need." She looked at him for a moment. "Coffee," she said. She pulled on her boots and her cardigan and they went downstairs together in the quiet of the house, and she poured 2 cups at the stove, and they sat at Mrs. Alcott's kitchen table in the lamplight like 2 people who had been doing this for years instead of 2 weeks. She wrapped both hands around the cup. "He's going to try to make me seem unstable," she said. "Webb, that's his method. Cooper told me he finds the emotional register of a witness and he applies pressure there until the jury sees feeling instead of fact." "I know," Silas said. "I have a tendency," she said carefully, "when I feel the ground shifting under me, to go very quiet. It's what I did on the ranch. Went quiet and waited for the thing to pass. Helen says I need to stay present in that room even when it's uncomfortable. That quiet reads as uncertain. It reads as a lot of things," Silas said. "Depends who's looking. The jury will be looking." "Then let them look at someone who knows her numbers cold," he said. "Because that's who's going to be in that room, not the woman who went quiet to survive. That woman did her job already. Tomorrow it's the bookkeeper's daughter." She looked at him across the table. "My father would have liked you," she said. "I'd like to have known him," he said. She looked at her coffee. "He used to say when I was nervous about something, when I was small and afraid of getting a figure wrong in front of someone who mattered, he used to say, 'Maggie, the numbers don't get nervous.' You don't have to either. Just read them out and let them speak for themselves." "Smart man, Silas," she said. "He was a very smart man." She paused. "I haven't thought about him that clearly in 3 years. I think I stopped letting myself think about him clearly, because everything before Whitlock's Ranch had a quality of something I'd lost, and it hurt to look at it." Silas was quiet for a moment. "And now? Now I think about him and it doesn't only hurt," she said. "Now it also feels like something I'm carrying forward." She looked up. "Is that strange?" "No," he said. "That's just grief settling into its right shape." She held his eyes for a moment. "Are you afraid?" she asked. He considered this honestly, which was what she expected from him. "Not for the case," he said. "Helen and Cooper have built it solid. The documentation is there. Clara's testimony is strong." He paused. "I'm afraid of what it will cost you, walking into that room." saying it out loud in front of people who might push back on every word. "It'll cost me something," she agreed. "It already has." "Yes, but staying cost me more," she said. "Every single day it cost me more." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It did." They sat until the coffee was gone, and the lamplight steadied, and the mountain outside began the first faint suggestion of dawn in the darkness. Then she said she should try to sleep for an hour, and he said that was sensible, and they went back upstairs, and she lay down on cloud eyes, and this time, to her genuine surprise, sleep came. She dreamed of her father's kitchen, the account ledger, his finger moving down the column of numbers, the specific smell of the lamp oil and the sound of his pencil on the page. The complete safeness of that room. She woke with it still on her, like warmth carried over from one place into another. She got up. She dressed carefully. She braided her hair the way her mother had shown her, clean, precise, nothing excessive, the presentation of a woman who respects the occasion without needing to perform for it. She put the contract in her satchel alongside her testimony notes and her account notebook. She put her father's journal in last, not because she would need it in the courtroom, but because she had developed a habit of carrying it. The same way she had developed the habit of carrying the contract in her apron pocket, a reminder that the thing was real and always had been. She went downstairs. Clara was already at the breakfast table, dressed and composed, her own leather case beside her chair. She looked up when Maggie came in and she said without preamble, "I'm ready." "So am I," Maggie said. They ate breakfast without much conversation. Neither of them required it. The courthouse in Glenwood Springs was a brick building with a solid, unadorned quality, built to last, built to be taken seriously, built without any particular interest in whether the people walking into it felt comfortable. Judge Hartley held his sessions with the reputation of a man who had no patience for theatrics on either side and a great deal of patience for documentation. Maggie learned this from Helen as they walked. Helen talked about Hartley the way she talked about everything efficiently, preparing the terrain. "He will ask you to speak clearly, and at a measured pace," Helen said. "He takes his own notes. If you see him writing, slow down. If you see him stop writing, you've lost him, and you need to bring him back with something specific." "All right," Maggie said.
Webb will object frequently.
"Don't react to the objections. They're not directed at you personally, even when they sound like they are. Keep your eyes on Judge Hartley unless I'm asking you a question. All right. If Webb asks you something you don't understand, ask him to repeat it. Don't guess at the intent of a question. Answer only what is actually being asked." "Helen," Maggie said. "Yes. I've been managing information under hostile conditions for 3 years," she said, not unkindly. "I understand how to handle questions from a man who wants me to trip." Helen looked at her. Then she smiled, brief, professional, but real. "Yes," she said, "I believe you do." They went in. Caleb Whitlock was already seated at the defense table. He was dressed in the way he dressed for occasions of consequence, completely controlled, nothing out of place, the presentation of a man who has nothing to be nervous about. He did not look at Maggie when she came in. He was speaking quietly with Marcus Webb, who was younger than she had expected, lean and focused, with the look of someone who cataloged everything he saw. Webb looked at Maggie when she walked in, one clean assessment. She held his gaze for exactly a moment, and then directed her eyes to where Helen was gesturing toward the plaintiff's table, and sat down. She put her satchel on the table in front of her. She put her hands flat on the table. She took one breath. The thing about the moment before something you've been building toward for weeks finally arrives is that it doesn't feel the way you expect it to feel. She had expected fear or resolve or some clean, dramatic emotion to organize itself in her chest. What she actually felt was simpler, a clear, settled readiness. The same feeling she got when a column of numbers finally balanced the click of things in their right place. Judge Hartley came in and the room stood and then sat. It began. Helen's presentation of the case was clean and methodical. She laid the contract first, the original, Foss's copy, the notary stamp, and walked the judge through the terms line by line. She presented the timeline of charge additions, each one documented against the date it first appeared in the visible ledger. She presented the comparison between what those charges totaled and what the original wage terms had promised. She presented the public supply merchant records and the cattle auction records, and showed how Maggie's private account figures matched them exactly. Caleb's face showed nothing. Webb objected 3 times during the presentation. Judge Hartley sustained 1 and overruled 2. The judge's pen moved steadily. Then Helen called Maggie to the stand. She walked up. She sat. She was administered the oath, and she said "I do" with the same voice she used for everything that mattered, clear, unhurried, belonging to her. Helen asked questions and she answered them. She answered them the way her father had taught her to present figures plainly, in order, without embellishment, because the truth did not need decoration. She described her arrival. She described the contract terms. She described the first additional charge, the second, the accumulation. She described the ledger on the shelf and the ledger in the locked drawer, and the specific morning she had seen both and understood the discrepancy. She described 63 calculations, and when Helen asked her to walk through one of them in full, she did it in memory without consulting the notebook, date by date and figure by figure, while the judge's pen moved without pause. When Helen finished, Webb stood. He was very good. She had been told he was very good, and the questions were constructed to seem neutral while pulling in a specific direction, designed to establish a pattern of emotional volatility, of grievance that preceded evidence, of a woman whose feelings had shaped her memory of figures she claimed to have recorded objectively. She watched the structure of the questions the same way she watched the structure of a ledger entry, looking for where it was going, what conclusion it was designed to produce. "Miss Caldwell," Webb said, in the pleasant voice of someone asking something casual, "isn't it true that you came to Mr. Whitlock's ranch in a state of financial desperation?" "I came with limited resources," she said. "And is it possible that desperation might lead someone to misread terms they desperately wanted to be favorable?" "Possible for some people," she said. "I had the contract in front of me when I signed it. The terms were not ambiguous. I read them as a person who had been trained to read financial documents, not as a person hoping they said what she needed." Webb paused, almost imperceptibly. She had taken the framing of his question and set it back down differently, and he had registered that. "You've described a second ledger that you claim to have seen in Mr. Whitlock's desk. He's a locked drawer." "I described it accurately," she said. "The drawer was locked, on every occasion but one." "On one occasion," he said. "You claim." "On one occasion," she said, "which I noted in my private account records the same evening, including the figures I observed, which I have since confirmed match the public commercial record. If the second ledger doesn't exist, someone will need to explain why my figures, which I recorded from memory in 3 minutes, match the supply merchant's receipts for the same periods exactly." She paused. "I'm sure Mr. Whitlock can produce that ledger for the court's review." That would settle the question. In the quiet that followed, she heard someone in the gallery draw a breath. Judge Hartley looked up from his notes and looked at Caleb Whitlock's table. Webb smoothed his jacket. "I have no further questions for this witness at this time," he said. She stood. She walked back to the plaintiff's table. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. They were steady. Helen leaned close and said very quietly, "That was exactly right." Clara Voss took the stand next. She was steady and specific, and she described 2 years on the Whitlock ranch in the same terms Maggie had described 3, and the parallel was not lost on the judge, who had stopped taking notes during Maggie's testimony to listen and had started again the moment Clara began. When Webb cross-examined Clara, she answered in the flat, accurate register of someone who has long since finished grieving and has arrived at something harder and more permanent. At one point, Webb asked her whether she had been in contact with Maggie Caldwell prior to the hearing, suggesting coordination of testimony. Clara looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been insulted and is deciding whether the insult deserves a full response. "We met 2 weeks ago," Clara said, "in Mr. Cooper's office. We compared our accounts at that time and found them consistent. We found them consistent because they described the same man using the same methods on different people at different times. That is not coordination. Webb moved on. Gerald Foss testified about the contract, about the man Caleb had sent to retrieve the notarized copy, about his 2 decades of practice and his certainty that retroactive correction to employment contracts were not a standard feature of legitimate labor arrangements. Thomas Aldrich's associate provided the documentation from the property records, the neighboring family's manufactured debt, the land absorption that had followed it, the cross-referenced pattern across 7 years of transactions in this valley. Marcus Webb had a great deal of objections during this portion. Judge Hartley sustained very few of them. The defense case lasted 1 day. Webb presented character witnesses, merchants who had done business with Caleb and found him fair, a neighboring rancher who said Whitlock had always dealt straight with him. He presented Caleb's own version of the accounts, which showed Maggie's debt as legitimate, and the additional charges as disclosed verbally at the time of her employment. Verbal disclosure, nothing in writing, against a contract that said otherwise. Webb was skilled enough not to put Caleb on the stand. Caleb was skilled enough to agree with that decision. A man who had built his protection on controlling the narrative could not afford to sit in a chair and answer questions from Helen Park, who would have walked him through 63 calculations with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. Closing arguments took the second morning. Helen was precise and without flourish. She presented the case as what it was: a documented pattern of contract violation, wage theft, and deliberate isolation designed to prevent legal recourse. She asked the judge to order restitution of wages at the original contract rate and to refer the property matter to territorial authorities for further investigation. Webb was eloquent. He spoke about the difficulty of mountain ranching, the complexity of labor arrangements, the unreliability of memories shaped by resentment. He was very good at his job. Maggie sat at the plaintiff's table and listened to Webb describe her resentment and thought, yes, I was resentful. Of course I was resentful. Resentment is the correct response to having your wages stolen and your voice taken away. Resentment is not evidence of dishonesty. Resentment is evidence of having been wronged. She did not say this out loud, but she held it. Judge Hartley took 2 hours. 2 hours during which Maggie sat in the courtroom anteroom with Helen and Clara and Franklin Cooper, and Silas sat across from her with his coffee and his hat and his particular quality of steadiness. And nobody talked much because there was nothing useful to say, and they were all smart enough to know it. Clara had her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the wall with the expression of someone who has given everything available to give and is now simply waiting for the world to respond. Maggie looked at her own hands. She thought about every morning she had woken up on that ranch and made her way downstairs and started the fire and begun the sequence of tasks that would fill the next 16 hours. She thought about the third step she always skipped. She thought about the 2 buckets she carried from the spring before the pump was fixed. She thought about the lamp oil Caleb charged her for month after month, a few cents at a time, small enough not to be worth arguing, large enough to matter across 3 years. She thought about the night she had pressed her back against the wall and heard his boots on the floorboards and prayed only to survive one more night. She had survived considerably more than one more night. The door opened. Cooper stood. "Judge is ready," he said. They filed back in. Caleb was already at the defense table. He looked straight ahead. Webb was very still beside him, with the particular stillness of a man who has done everything available to him and is now also waiting. Judge Hartley settled his papers. He did not look up immediately. He read something to himself one final time, made a notation, and then looked at the room. "I have reviewed the documentation presented by the plaintiff in its entirety," he said, "including the original contract and notarized copy, the private account records and their correspondence with public commercial documentation, and the testimony provided by both the plaintiff and the supporting witness." He paused. "I have also reviewed the defendant's account of the labor arrangement and the character testimony presented on his behalf." The courtroom was absolutely silent. "The original contract is unambiguous," he said. The wage terms are clearly stated. The conditions of employment are clearly stated. The plaintiff's account records demonstrate, with reference to independently verifiable commercial records, a systematic pattern of unauthorized deductions from wages owed under those terms. He looked down at his papers. The defense's argument that additional charges were verbally disclosed at the time of employment is inconsistent with the contract terms and unsupported by any documentation. In 22 years on the bench, I have not once seen a legitimate employment arrangement in which the employer's interests were served by declining to put material terms in writing. Maggie's hands were flat on the table. I am finding in favor of the plaintiff, Judge Hartley said. The defendant is ordered to pay the sum of $418 in back wages at the original contract rate, plus court costs. I am further referring the property matter to the Territorial Land Office for formal investigation, and I am placing a formal notice of finding in the public record of this district, which will be accessible to any future parties seeking to verify the defendant's business practices. He looked at Caleb Whitlock for a long moment. Mr. Whitlock, he said, you are fortunate this proceeding was limited to labor matters. The property documentation presented by Mr. Aldris' inquiry suggests that your next court appearance may not be resolved so narrowly. I would encourage you to consult counsel on that matter at your earliest opportunity. He paused. We are adjourned. The gavel, the room moved. Maggie sat still for one moment while everything around her shifted. Cooper shaking Helen's hand, Clara standing and pressing her fingers over her eyes briefly, and then composing herself, Webb leaning close to Caleb and saying something quiet. Caleb's face showing nothing except the specific quality of a man recalculating his position with the focus of someone for whom the calculation never truly stops. She looked at the table. $418. Her figure, her calculation. 63 times, always the same number. And the judge had said it out loud in this room, and it was real now in the way that official things become real, documented, witnessed, entered into the record that anyone could read. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Clara's hand, brief and warm, and then Clara moved away toward Cooper. She stood up. Silas was at the back of the room. He had not been at the plaintiff's table. There had been no reason for him to be, no legal standing that put him there. He had sat in the gallery through both days, present, quiet, hat in his hands. He was standing now, and he was looking at her, across the length of the room. She walked toward him. The room was full of movement and sound, and she moved through it without stopping until she was standing in front of him. He looked at her. Well, she said. $418, he said. That's what the number said, she said. 63 times, he repeated. And there was something in his voice that she was fairly certain no one else in the room could hear, a quality of feeling that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with the past several weeks and all the coffee and all the lamplit. Calculations and all the mornings she had walked into his steadiness and found it exactly where she had left it. Thank you, she said. He shook his head slightly. You walked into that courthouse on your own, he said. You spoke. I watched, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. I did. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him, through the courthouse door that someone had propped open, at the street outside and the mountain beyond it and the sky above it, which was the particular deep blue of a late morning in Colorado, when the weather is good and the air is clean and the world is not, at this exact moment, pressing down on you with all its accumulated weight. She took a breath of it. She was 31 years old. She had $418 coming to her, and a name that was going into the public record, on the right side of a judge's decision, and the entirety of her future arranged in front of her, without any of the walls she had spent 3 years learning to navigate. She had more choices than she knew what to do with. That was going to take some getting used to. They walked out into the morning together, her and Silas and Clara and Cooper and Helen, emerging from the brick building into the ordinary world, which was going about its business with the cheerful indifference of a world that does not know what just happened to someone inside one of its buildings. Clara stopped on the steps and turned her face up toward the sky for a moment, eyes closed. Then she opened them and looked at Maggie. I'm going back to Denver tomorrow, she said. I have a job at a milliner's shop. I've been there 2 years. It is, Clara agreed. She paused. I'm glad we did this, so am I. Clara looked at Silas. Then back at Maggie. Whatever she observed in the space between them produced a small, precise smile. Take care of yourself, Maggie Caldwell, she said. You too, Clara Voss, Maggie said. They shook hands. Clara went with Cooper to handle the documentation. Helen had 2 more clients to see this afternoon, and she had said her goodbyes inside with the efficiency of someone for whom the completion of a case was its own sufficient satisfaction. Maggie and Silas stood on the courthouse steps in the morning light. I need to send a telegram to Aldrich, she said. Tell him it's done. Cooper will do that, Silas said, and Foss deserves a letter. He does. She looked at the street, at the mountain, at the ordinary beautiful morning happening all around them. And then, she said, I suppose I need to think of what comes next. I suppose you do, he said. She looked at him sideways. You mentioned a piece of land, she said. I did, he said. North of here. About 2 days' ride with potential. Quite a bit of it, in my opinion. He said it with the understatement that was simply his register for things that mattered to him. You said it needed accounts managed properly, she said. It does, he said. By someone who knows what they're doing with numbers. Ideally, he said. She turned to look at him fully. He was looking at her with that expression she had catalogued over the past weeks, not performing anything, not angling toward a particular response, simply present and honest and waiting, the way he waited for everything. With the patience of a man who had learned that the right things came to you if you did not try to force them. I'm going to need a written contract, she said, with the terms clearly stated. Signed and witnessed. Something moved across his face, startled for just a moment, and then unmistakably warm, and then gathered back into its usual steadiness, though the warmth didn't entirely leave. I would expect nothing less, he said. Fair wages, she said. My own room. The right to leave at any time. All of that, he said. Written down. Witnessed. He paused. And I should tell you, I'm a zookeeper myself, but I am nowhere near your level. I expect you'll find problems in my records I've been blind to for years. I expect I will, she said. I'm counting on it, he said. And that edge of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More than one. She looked at the mountain. She thought about the contract in her satchel. She thought about the steps she had always skipped on her way back to a room she'd had no choice but to return to. She thought about the cold water she had carried in buckets from the spring, before a man she had known for one tight game outside before dawn and fixed the pump, because he was making sure she had water. She thought about her father's voice saying, "The numbers don't get nervous." You don't have to either. She thought about 3 years, and what they had cost and what they had somehow also built the specific, unbreakable knowledge of what she could endure, what she was capable of, what she was worth. $418. 63 calculations. One contract, one judge, one man who had knocked on a door with the weight of someone who understood that what was on the other side of it deserved to be seen. She breathed in the Colorado morning. Then she picked up her satchel, and she set her face toward whatever came next, and she walked forward into her own life with the full, unhurried confidence of a woman who had spent 3 years learning the shape of what was owed to her and was no longer interested in accepting anything less. Margaret Caldwell had been forgotten on a mountain for 3 years. She would not be forgotten again. She had made sure of it herself.